Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. After a lot of requests from you folks about a backend video containing cookie sessions or authentication, here we are. In this video, we are going to work with Node.js, Express, Redis, MongoDB, and we are going to make sure that we create a couple of APIs with a working applications, which is a full stack application, and we are going to implement cookie session authentication in that. We are going to have protected routes. We are also going to deploy this to Heroku and use cloud providers so our application is live and everybody can use that. Now there are a lot of small bits and pieces throughout the video which teach you a lot of things which I cannot explain right now in this intro. So go through the entire video and let me know in the comments what was the best part of this whole video. And now a bit of word from our sponsor for this video. And it is none other than the Rapid API, which is doing a lot of amazing things, including providing a Rapid API hub where you can find APIs with different models, most time for free, that you can use within your application. And also it provides you the opportunity to create your own APIs and basically going and publishing them and also making money out of it. If you've not watched the video, watch this video where I told you how to create an API and sell it for passive income. And one big part of this video is how do we make sure that we don't leave Visual Studio Code while the entire development. And for that, I want you to go to codewithsn.dev/rapid API-extension. And once you go there, you're going to install this. This is an amazing extension and I absolutely love it. Let me show you what it does. So it allows you to create APIs within your VS Code so you don't have to leave it. You can avoid context switching because you don't have to switch windows in this case. And what I love about this is that you can manage different environments like development, production, have variables that you could use within the API so you don't have to write them. And also it works amazingly good with the themes. For example, if I wanted to switch a theme that could look pretty cool, for example, the shades of purple, you would see that it would affect the entire extension and it would look exactly how my code looks, which is super cool. After it, you can also copy the code from here that is generated for fetch, jQuery, Axios, and just see the code or even copy it to your project. So it has a lot of features and it's going to benefit you a lot. Now, having said that, we are going right into the video. But before that, I would highly appreciate if you can like the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not already, because I know that a lot of people want to learn this stuff and it would be amazing if we can share all of this together. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing that I want you to do is to install a couple of extensions, because the whole idea of this video is to leave Visual Studio Code as less as possible. So we're going to start with the Rapid API extension, which we will use for building REST APIs or actually testing REST APIs right in VS Code. So you go to codewithsn.dev/rapid API/extension. When you go there, you can find this Rapid API client, or you can just search it over Google and then install it. I have already installed this, so I don't really need to do it again. And you also need to install the MongoDB extension because we are going to use MongoDB as the database to store our users and the languages. Apart from this, we are also going to use Redis Explorer because we are going to use Redis for storing our authenticated sessions or our sessions in general. So once we have installed all these extensions, we can now go ahead and see how the final application looks like. So if you see my screen right now, you can see that we have this login page, we have this sign up page, and then I can sign up or log in right here. For example, if I log in with an existing user, I'm taken to the home page where I'm shown my favorite language, which actually is JavaScript, of course, and you can mark your language as favorite, and that's pretty much it. It's a really simple application and multiple users can log in and mark languages as their favorite language. I can also log out and I can register and I can play around with the application itself. Now that you have seen the final application, there are a few things that you need to get started. First of all, you need to have Node.js installed in your machine. So just Google Node.js download and then install accordingly for your operating system. Then you also need Git because we are going to push our code to GitHub. You also need VS Code, of course, because we install all these extensions into VS Code. And we are going to scaffold or start our Node.js backend project using something called ExpressJS, which is a Node.js based framework. And in this one, we are going to use the Express generator without any view engine. By default, Express comes with Jade, I believe, as the default engine, but we are going to use the no view option here so we don't get any view engine and we just get simple plain HTML files. So now we are going to generate the Node.js project. So open your terminal or command prompt. You need to make sure that you're in the folder where we need to run this express generator command. So first create a folder, and I already have a folder, so I'm just going to cd into it. So I'm going to do cd node redis auth, but you could run mkdir node redis auth to generate the folder, or you can use file explorer or finder, whatever suits your operating system, to create a folder. Then you cd into the node redis auth folder, and then you run npx express generator, and here you supply the no view parameter. You will notice that this generator creates a lot of files within the folder, and all we need to do now is to open this into VSCode and basically run npm install, and then we can start the server. So I'm going to run this code command so we can open this into VSCode. Now that we have opened this, you can click terminal and new terminal, so we don't have to even leave the VS Code window for terminal or command prompt. So you can see I've already opened this here. Now you need to run npm install so we can install the packages that are dependent for this project. So once you run npm install, you can run npm start after it, which will essentially start the Express server. You can see that we don't get any error here, and by default when we run the npm start command, it goes to package.json, and then here it picks the script start, which runs node bin www. If I open the bin www, here you can see that we have a bunch of JavaScript code which essentially runs the server, and that's how it's working for us. Now that we know how to start the server by npm start, we can check this server out into our browser. So I'm going to go to localhost 3000 now, and if I hit enter, you can see that we see this really nice message saying Express, welcome to Express. If we go back to our code, you will see that if I open app.js, there is a bunch of code here. But what I'm trying to take you to is this slash or app use slash. When we hit this particular route, this means localhost 3000 slash, or just localhost 3000. When we talk about this users route, that would mean localhost 3000 slash users. And then we also need to have a look inside this index router, which we are importing from routes slash index. So if I open routes slash index, there we have other definitions of what's happening. By default, you can see that it says router.get slash, and you can see that it says rest.render blah blah blah. Then you also see that we have this users.js, which has a similar approach. Now you can see that those two are quite similar. We have router.get slash and then router.get slash. Don't they really look exactly the same? But the reality is that it is combined with this definition here. So essentially, when we are talking about users router, any route that we define inside here would have the users prefix with it, which means that this route that we are looking at right now, this is actually localhost 3000 slash users. If I define another route here with something like this, maybe if I say something like users slash me, then that would mean that you're talking about this localhost 3000 users slash me. So it basically combines this route with the parent one, or with this definition that we are providing right here. So if I just go ahead and put some code there, for example, for me, I could say something like I am me, and here we have respond with the resource for users. So I'm going to just save these two, and then if I go to localhost 3000 slash me or slash users, you will see that it says respond with the resource, which is good. But if I now go to users slash me, you will see that it says cannot get it. Why is that so? If I go back to my code, you can see that we do have this slash me defined here, but the fact that this doesn't work is because we need to restart, stop, and start our server every time we make a change now in our file. So I need to stop it, do npm start, and then if I go back to my browser and refresh, you can see that now it works. So this is a bit troublesome because I would have to restart my server every time I make a change. So to avoid this, we have a really nice tool called Nodemon, and we can install it and use it rather. So we can do npm install, and here we can say Nodemon. And then once this package is installed, we can go to our package.json, and here instead of node, we can say Nodemon and hit save. Then I can run npm start, and you will see the change or the difference that instead of node, now it runs Nodemon, and we got a bunch of logs here. Now, if I go and just hit save or Control S here, you will see that this will restart the server. So if I hit Control S, you can see that it's restarting whenever I'm trying to save these files. So if I go back here, you can see that this says I am me. If I go back to my code now and change this to I am Asan and save this, you will see that I don't have to restart my server. I can just see the change here. So this makes development much more easier. Now that we understand this, let's talk about some interesting scenarios. First of all, this users is going to be called auth because we are going to have login and register and logout as well. So this is going to be called auth. So we need to rename our users router to maybe auth router. Then we also need to change this here, or actually this is changed already. So I need to use auth router right here. And this should rather be auth instead of users. Now that we have these changes here, I'm going to actually remove these and hit save. So you can see that now we don't have any errors. So this should work fine. I'm going to convert all these vars to const because this express generator, it looks like it never updated those. And I would hate to see var all the time. So now I'm just saving it. Now you can see that we got some routes here, but we are going to change them to, for example, login and not login actually. We're going to change them to post call, but let's do that later. Now that we have these things, let's talk about what we can do next. We can start with identifying how to store sessions in our application, because for authentication, we are talking about having a session of the user. There are different sort of authentication. We have token-based authentication, session-based authentication. In this video, we are talking about session-based authentication. So we are going to use cookie sessions to maintain the state. And when we talk about session, it's not just only for authentication. We can essentially store anything in a session that is just restricted to that particular session. For example, I'm a user. And for example, if I as a user want to just see how much time I spend on a particular site, I could keep that in session. So I can have multiple devices having multiple session. Even though it's a single user, it could have multiple session and it could save those things within those sessions. Now, let's talk about how do we create a session in ExpressJS. To use a session, we need to install a new package. So I'm going to do npm install and we have express-session as the package that we need. Once we get this, we can start using this into our app.js. So we can go ahead and say const session equals require, and here we can say express-session. Once we have this, we can go ahead simply and say something like app.use. So we are going to start using those sessions. So we can say app.use here, not unsubscribe, app.use. Here we are going to provide session, and this takes an object of options. So here I can say resave, which is set to false. When we say resave set to false, that would mean that if a particular thing does not change into a session, we do not resave the session. So we are not saving the same object every time. Similarly, we also have save uninitialized, which means that if a user tries to use our application and has not done anything that is supposed to be saved in a session, we don't save the session. For example, if we set this to true, that would mean that even if the user is not logged in, we create a session. So we don't want that. We only want to create a session when the user is logged in, which means that when the user logs in, we are going to save something in this session. And that's when it is initialized. Finally, we have a secret that we can use here. So we have different ways of saving the secret or actually defining it here. The easiest way is to just put it here, but this is a bit risky because that would mean this file goes to GitHub, for example, goes public. My secret would also go public, and we really don't want that. So instead of this, this should be in your env files or environment files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use another package called .env. So we can use env file for our secret. So I'm going to create a new file here. We are going to call this .env, and here I'm going to define a variable. Here we are going to call something like session secret, and then here I could say my secret, for example, and then I can use this session secret variable here. In our app.js, we also want to now require, so we can say something like require and then .env, and here we can say .config. Once we do this, we can essentially use the config right away. You can see that it essentially returns the .env config output. So in this particular situation, you should also be able to get it. So we can do something like const config, and here equals to this whole thing.
Now that we have got the config here, I can go ahead and say something like process.env.secret or session secret. So then I don't really need this particular config here. And finally, I could also check it. For example, if I go ahead and paste this here, we could say something like session config equals this. And then I could maybe just log it for now. So I could say something like, first of all, let's pass this. Then I could also say console.log, and here I could say session config. Now, if I run npm start, we should be able to see this in the log. So here you can see that session config is actually getting my secret, and my secret is not defined here. It is defined inside this env file. So we are getting this and we are applying this and using this just to make sure that we are getting this right. Otherwise, we don't really need this console log, and you should not be logging your secrets into console on production specifically, but also in development as well. Now that we have got this env situation working fine, let's talk about something. Let's create a new route where we could say hello, for example. So I could say app.use something like this. So app.use, and in here we could define hello as a temporary route. In here, we're going to see how many times the user comes and views this page or this route. And here we are going to say res.send. And in this case, we are just going to send a string with the view count. So we could say view count is, and here we should have a variable that essentially has the view count. So in this case, we should have a view count variable. Now, how do we get this view count? By default, we are going to initialize that with 0, but we are going to increase it every time. So by default, we are going to check if the current session contains a view count or not. So we can say if request, and the request should come here, and we should have a response here as well. So we could say something like request.session.view count. If we have a view count, and we can actually check if it is undefined, which means that this has not been initialized yet. So if this is not initialized, then we do 0. Otherwise, what we do is we just do an increment there. So we can do something like this, plus plus. And what we do in the end is just use this request.session.viewCount directly here. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to save this now, and I'm going to go to my browser, and I'm going to go to the hello route. If I hit enter, you can see that it says view count is 0. If I refresh now, you can see that the counter increases every time I refresh this page. So we are hitting this route every time, or this API call, and we get the view count. Now, an interesting thing is that if I go to a new tab in an incognito window, which basically simulates a different browser, and hit the same URL, you can see that here it says view count is 1. So if I keep refreshing, you can see that this basically keeps a track of the view count differently because it's a different session compared to this particular browser. So if I keep refreshing, you can see that this is maintaining its own count, and this one is maintaining its own count. But we have a really interesting situation here, and that is if I stop the server and start it again, let's see what happens. If I go back to my browser and refresh, you can see that the view count is 0. If I go to the other instance as well, you can see that the view count is 0, which means that if we restart our server, the whole session, everything is destroyed. And that is because all of this is being saved in memory. So we are not using any persistent storage to store the session. Now, this is just a view count, but we are talking about a user session which would have users data, at least the user ID, so we can use it into different API calls. But if we don't have a persistent storage, restarting the server will lose all that data or all the sessions. Imagine hundreds of thousands of users using your application, and you restart the server or have to restart the server, and then everyone gets logged out. That's what we are talking about here. So we need a persistent storage, and for that we are going to use something called Redis. So to install Redis, you can just go to redis.io, and then you can go to get started, and then you can basically land on this page if you are on Windows. If you're on Mac, then there are different instructions, but since I'm on Windows, I'm going to talk about how to use this on a Windows machine. So first of all, you need to install or enable WSL2, which means that essentially we are telling Windows that we want to use a subsystem in Windows, which is the Ubuntu subsystem or a Linux subsystem. And once we have done that, we are going to start the Redis service within that system. So once you install or follow all of these instructions, finally, you need to run sudo service redis server start, and you should be able to do that. Another way is that once you have Ubuntu or Ubuntu installed in your machine, you can just open it. And then you need to run all of these commands. You need to run this one, and then this one, this one, this one, and this one. Notice that first we are installing the Redis repository into Linux or our Ubuntu. Then we are trying to update the Linux packages which might be outdated. And then once we are done with that, we are installing the Redis server package. Once that's done, we are running this command to just restart or essentially start the Redis server. For example, if I go ahead and first let me see if I've started it already. So I'm gonna basically run this. So I'm gonna just paste it here and then I can say stop. It's asking for my password. Rather, what I want to do is to do a restart. So I'm gonna just say server restart, and you can see that it's stopping the server and starting the server, and I should now be able to connect with Redis right now. But I'll not do that at the moment. Once you have this service ready, we can start talking to this Redis server and storing our information into Redis. To work with Redis, we are going to need a few packages more, unfortunately, but we do need some sort of way to connect our node backend to Redis. So how do we do this? We are going to install two packages. We are going to run npm install redis and then connect Redis. So the Redis package basically talks to Redis or creates or helps us create the Redis client. And then the connect Redis is essentially connecting our ExpressJS framework with Redis to populate that session automatically and save it in Redis. Now that we have this, we are going to do const, and here we are going to require from Redis. So we can do require Redis, and here we are going to essentially require create client from Redis. Then we are going to do const connect Redis, and here we can essentially say require, and here we can say connect Redis. After this, we are going to create a Redis store. So we can essentially go down here and we can say const Redis store equals connect Redis, and we can provide the session inside there. So notice that we are using the connect Redis and we are essentially providing this session object here, and then that session is being used afterwards in the app as well. So this is all connected, so to say. Now that we have this, we need to change our session object a bit. So instead of this configuration, we are going to paste this one, and notice what has changed. First of all, we are using the Redis store that we created here. We are providing the Redis client that we created before that. Actually, we haven't done that. So we need to do that. We can say const Redis client equals create client. And here we can provide legacy mode to true. So we need this Redis client. So we are using Redis client here. Then we have the secret here. So we can use the same thing, process.env. What was the variable again? It was session secret. So we can say session secret. Then we have resave false, save initialize false, and then we have cookie here. Now this is important. We need to understand these properties. When we say secure false, that means that any HTTP call, which is not HTTPS, and it doesn't have SSL certificate, can access our cookies or can access this app in general. So when we say secure false, it's bad. So you should not deploy this to production setting this as false. This should always be true. Secondly, we have HTTP only set to false. When this is set to true, the web page cannot access the cookie in JavaScript. But if you set this to false, we are able to access it. Then we have the max age, which basically kind of expires the cookie after a certain time. So this is in milliseconds. So this is just saying 10 minutes in this case. Now, if we save this, we are going to see if this connects with our Redis store or not. So now that we have changed this, the only thing that is remaining is we need to connect to the Redis instance by using something like Redis client. So we can do it here. So we can say Redis client dot connect, and then here we can say catch, and then we can say error, and here we go. We can simply say console.log, and here we can say could not connect to Redis, and then we can also show the error in this case. So I'm going to just save this and I'm going to try it out. If I now run npm start, you will see that we do not get any error, which means that Redis is connected, but this is kind of risky. Let's see if we can get an error when Redis server is down or when we are not running the Redis service. So I'm going to go ahead into Ubuntu and I'm going to say sudo service Redis server stop. So it should be stopping the Redis server, but sometimes from Ubuntu, it doesn't really stop the service. So what you could do is you could run Windows and R command, and then you can type services.msc, then you should be able to see all these services. So you click here, press R, and here is Redis. So you stop this service and that should be good. Now, if I go back to my code and start the server, let's see what happens. You can see that here we got an error, could not connect to Redis, and then connection refused. And that is because the Redis service is not running. So we are going to go back again to Ubuntu, and here we need to start the service. So we can say start. And now if I run the server again, you should be able to see that we are connected. We don't get that error, which means Redis now is connected. Now remember that we also installed an extension for Redis, which is the Redis Explorer. So if I go here down, you can see that I can click it. And here I can add a connection. So I'm going to actually close this so I can show this to you. So if I hit plus, you can see that here we have a nickname. So we can say something like local server, then you hit enter, then you type localhost for the host server. Then you use the default port and then no password. Once you do this, you can see that we have this local server here and it doesn't have anything. So I'm going to expand this a bit so you can see the name here, and it doesn't have anything at the moment. So if I open this, we don't have anything. So now that we have this working, let's talk about the API calls. So here in the app.js file, we use this hello route in which we create or we assign a value to the view count, which is in the session. So now if I do anything with the session, that should essentially go to the Redis cache or to the Redis database. So I'm going to go to my browser and hit refresh. And now you can see that the view count is 0, but this now is in Redis. How do we know? We can go back to our VS Code and here we can just refresh. And here you can see that now we have this session information in here. You can see that we get HTTP only false, secure false, path, and also the view count, which is right now 0. Now, another thing that we can do is start using Rapid API. So I'm going to go and click Rapid API here, and then we are going to start creating our first request. Now, in this particular case, you would just add a request, but before that, you can see the environments. By default, I believe it only has development or production. I'm not entirely sure, but you can essentially click here, the groups, and then you can manage it. You can see that we got two different groups, production and development, and we can also assign variables here. So imagine this variable not being here, but right now since it's here, so I'm going to just say it's here, but you can essentially define multiple variables here. I'm calling it base URL, and you can see that I've defined this as HTTP localhost 3000. Now in production, this is empty, but you can use your production URL as well. Now that we have defined this, when we create a new request by just clicking this plus, and notice that I'm using the development mode as selected right now. When I click this plus button, this will essentially create a new request for me. You can see that I can now put the method here, the URL here, and also I can go ahead and do further crazy things. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say hello, and in here I can say get. But here I can use the environment variable. So if I press the starting curly brace, you can see that there is environment variable. I can click this, I can click this again, and now I can click the base URL. Once I'm selecting this, you can see that it shows the value here, which is localhost 3000, and I can just type /hello here, and that should be good. Now I don't have to type localhost 3000 in every different call, which is super weird. So we don't really want that. Here, I'm also giving this name hello, and this is being reflected here as well. So I think we are good. Now, if I hit send here, what would happen? You can see that we get the response back. If I send this again, it's going to keep this as 0. Why is that? Because this is not a web page. So this is not really capable of handling cookies. It will get cookies as a response from the server, but this will not store it anywhere. So there is no session being created in this case. However, if I go back to my Redis server from Explorer, and if I hit reload, you can see that every time I click this, I send this a call, it creates a new session on the server. However, on the browser, there's no cookie stored, or not on the browser. However, in VS Code, there's no cookie stored. So that's why it cannot keep track of the same session. I can click all of these and you will see that all of these have the view count as 0. So in this particular situation, I think we're going to keep it at this. But a couple of more things that I would like to highlight about this whole extension as an experience, and that is how this adapts to the theme that I'm currently using. For this, I'm going to use a really good example. And instead of just returning this as a text, I'm going to change this to a JSON. So I'm going to go ahead here and just respond back as a JSON and do res.json. And here I can say something like a view count or message. Both are fine. And I'm just going to send this back as JSON. You can see that I just switched from a REST API client to my code even without leaving VS Code. And this is what I'm talking about. This is a really good experience. Now, if I hit send here, you can see that now we get back this data as JSON. And if I kind of extract this, something like this would look a bit better. And now you can see that I would have another session here. As you can see, one more added. But what I was talking about this extension is that if I go and change my theme from preferences, color theme, and select some other cool theme, for example, shades of purple, you should see that now this whole extension reflects all the cool colors that my VS Code has. And this is super cool because it so feels natural to me to see the same fonts similar to how we have in package.json, for example, or in my app.js. So this is super cool. This is one more thing that I really like about this whole Rapid API extension or the REST API client. Now, if I want to go and see headers, I could also do that. I'm going to first go ahead and change my theme back. So I'm going to go back to this one, dark blue, no italics. Now that we have a good example of session done already, and this is being stored in Redis, I'm actually going to clear all these sessions. So I'm going to delete them all. Now that we have this, we are going to start writing some routes for static pages. So in here, you will notice something interesting. So if I open my files here, you can see that in the app.js, we are using this slash, which is going towards index router. And then we have this route, which is returning index. Now you would imagine that this index is actually the index HTML inside this public folder, which says welcome to Express. So if I go to my browser again and go to localhost 3000, you will see that we see this message, right? But the fact is that this is not really linked. So if I go ahead and remove all of this, what would happen in this case? So I'm gonna remove this whole thing, hit save. The server is automatically restarted, so I don't really need to care about it. And now if I hit refresh, it still works. How does it work? It works because in the app.js, we have this line of code which says express.static, and then we are saying that the public folder should serve static files. By default, when you provide a route and we have index.html inside, it doesn't have to show index.html here, and it loads it right away as the default web page. Now I could also say slash index.html and we will get the exact same result. So if I'm doing this like this, and if I go ahead and say slash login, and if I had a login.html, would it exactly be the same? For example, I could copy this and I could paste this file inside and I could rename this to login. So let's actually go ahead and rename this to login.html. Now, if I refresh this and try to go to slash login, what would happen? You can see that it doesn't work. Why doesn't this work? Because there is no route in our application with slash login. But hey, how does this work then? As I mentioned, if on a particular route there is index.html, it doesn't have to know, or we don't have to specify index.html, it automatically gets it. But if I want login.html, then I would have to say login.html and then it would show. Now you can see that this is the same text, but this URL works. So if I go ahead into login.html and say something like or login user, for example, and remove, or actually let's do this. And then if I refresh here, you can say login user. So on home page, we have Express. On login page, we have this. So how do we go to login via routing in this case? For this, we need to create some routes, and we are going to do that in index.js. So in the routes/index.js, where we had this route before, I'm going to specify a login route here, and I'm going to say that it should send back the login HTML. And we do that by saying res.send, and then here we are going to say index.html, and then this object gets changed into this. So we are essentially joining the paths by saying right now, whichever directory I am in, and I'm right now in routes, go one step above and then look at the public page. and find the index.html there, or actually this should be rather login.html, and this should work in that case. Now I can change this function to an ES6 function or an arrow function. I can remove next, I'm not using it, and I'm also not using request, so I can basically say underscore here. And now you will see that we are sending back login.html with this really nice code. So I'm gonna require path, so I'm going to say const path equals require path, and now I can change these vars also into const, and now I can save this. Now if I go back to my browser and if I only use login like this, so I can go and say slash login and hit enter, you can see that we still got something wrong. So I'm going to go back to my code and see what's wrong. Yeah, this should rather be send file instead of send. So I'm going to save this now, hit refresh, and now you can see that the login route shows the login page in that case. I'm going to do the same thing for register. So I'm going to copy this, paste this here, and then I'm going to rename this and I'm going to call this register. In this case, we should have a register user. So I can save this now. Obviously, I would have to create another route inside index.js, the same for register. So I can say register here, and I can also say register here. Now you will notice that we are duplicating this whole object 2 times. So I'm a big fan of reusing things. So I'm gonna just make this a variable. So I can say something like public root config, and here we can just say that, and then I can use this right here and then also right here and just hit save. Now this should render register HTML. So I can go back to my browser, refresh, and go to register and refresh, and you can see that this works flawlessly, so we have no issues. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go ahead and copy the code, the actual code or HTML CSS for the pages from this gist. So you need to go to gist.github.com/snirs, and you can basically find this link in the description of this video. Once you go there, you can copy index.html and then login.html and then register.html from here. So this is the index.html. So I'm going to copy this code into the index.html file, going to save it. Then I'm going to go back to my browser for the next one, which is login.html, and similarly for register.html. So we have replaced now all the files. So I'm going to go back to my page here in the browser, and if I refresh, you can see that we have the code for register. If I want to go to login, you can see that I can go to login as well. And if I go to my home page, you see this. This is the application that we have. So here it has logout button, but nothing else. So we are going to write some code for it later on. Now that we have this, let's talk about how we can authenticate the user using cookies. So we already have had some routes here, but we are going to create the login and register one inside now. So I'm going to close everything else that we have here, close others. And now let's talk about having some routes for authentication. So I'm going to have one for login, and notice that we are inside the auth file at the moment. So one for login, and then we are going to have the same for register. So I'm going to just write code for this one for now. So in this particular situation, let's suppose we had a temporary DB. So we can say something like const temp DB here, and then here we have an array. So what we are going to do is that when anyone registers, we are going to save them here. And then once they log in, we are going to check if the user already is in this temp DB. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to expect that we get the username and password here, and then we are going to take it from there. So we are going to assume that this call would take a username and a password, and we are taking this out from req.body or request body. Then what we are going to do is, actually, let's talk about register first. So register. Then what we are going to do is we are going to check if this user already exists in the temp DB. So we can say something like const existing user equals temp db.find. So since we are running a find on an array, we are going to essentially get a user every time in this case. And then what we do is we say user.username equals the username that we have got from the request body. If we get an existing user, then we stop right here and we can say return res.status, and here we can say 400.json, and in this JSON we are going to say message user already exists. If the user does not exist, then we are going to push this data into the database. So we are going to say something like tempdb.push, and then we are going to push the username and password, or an object with username password. So this is essentially the user that we are talking about. So we add a user to the database, and then we do res.status 200 and then .json. And in this JSON, we essentially send back a user with the username and password in this case. So that's what we have done. But we forgot to do one little thing, and that is we also need to assign this into the session. So we can say req.session.user equals, and here we are going to use the same thing. We are going to put this here. Now again, we are doing a lot of same thing, username password a lot of times. So we can say something like const user equals, and here we can take this into one object, and then we can use tempdb.push user. This is going to be user, and then I can remove all of this. So the code becomes much smaller and clean. Super cool. Now that we have this, we are going to do the same for login. But first, let's try this call out. So I'm going to open Rapid API, and here I'm going to create another call. So I'm going to call this one a register. So I can first get the env variable, and I can say this is going to be base URL / register. Then we are also going to make this a post call. We are going to call this user or register user in this case. In the headers, we need to have a couple of things, otherwise our code will not parse it. So we should have something called content type, and then here we can say application /JSON, and then also we can define accept, and then we can say application /JSON in this case. And now we also need to define the body. The body is going to be a JSON, so we are going to say username. This username is going to be SN, and the password is going to be something like demo123. I can close this so we have a better view of this. Now you can see, and I can also pretty print this anytime, just like this. So I absolutely like it. Now that we have this, let's try this call out. So one really good tool that I also like about Rapid API extension is if I want the code out of it, if I want to run this from somewhere else, I can just go ahead and click this code button, and this would show me how this would look, for example, for JavaScript. Similarly, I can get code for Node.js, PHP, Python. Let's try this from Python then. And here you can see we have got code for Python for this one. So I really like this, that Rapid API automatically provides us all of this. Anyways, now if I hit send request, let's see what happens. So if I hit this send request, you can see that it says cannot post register, and that is because the URL is incorrect. This should be auth/register, because this is auth.js, which has register in it, and we have the app.js saying that we should have /auth. So it's /auth/register. So here we have defined this correctly. Now if I hit send now, you can see that we get back the user with the username and password. Super cool. We also get in response this session ID that you can see here. Now if I try to do the same thing, which is registering the same user, do you think it's going to work? So if I just go ahead and hit send again, now in the response in the JSON tree, you see that we get a message user already exists. So if I hit send again, you can see we see 400 byte request, user already exists. So it's not creating that user anymore. Now that we have seen this, and in the complex scenario, we are also going to use the debuggers, but now we have seen that this registration works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this request. So I'm going to go to Rapid API, and here I'm going to duplicate this request right here. And then I'm going to use this one for logging in. So I'm going to go ahead here and say auth/login. And then the body is exactly the same here. So if I hit send, it's going to work. No, because we don't have this route defined yet in our code. And I again like this, that I don't have to switch context. So I can quickly go to auth.js, and then I can just copy the code and paste it here. Now there are going to be some changes, of course, here. In this situation, we are not really registering a user. We are rather checking the login. So in this one, we need to find this existing user. If we don't find this existing user, then we should say something like user does not exist. So does not exist. So what we are doing in here is that first we get the username password from request body. Then we check if there is an existing user. If we don't have that, then we send this message back. Otherwise, we need to compare the password in this case. So in this case, we are going to check else if the existing user.password not equals to the password that we got from our request body in this case, then we are going to do return and then res.status 400. We could also have sent 401 in this case, or actually 404, not found, user doesn't exist. So we could also do that. Otherwise, we could just say 400. It's up to us. Maybe 404 is better. And then I could do JSON here. And then here I could say something like message. And here we can say password is incorrect, for example. Notice that we are using the return statement, so we don't have to have another if condition here. So if those conditions do not meet, then we are going to run the rest of the command. So in this case, we are getting the user name and password, but we shouldn't rather be doing that. In this case, we already have the existing user here. So if we already have that, then we should be assigning the existing user into request.session.user. We don't have to push this. We don't have to have this code. And the returning user is just this existing user. Or you could have request.session.user. It really doesn't matter. Now, if I just save this and if I try this out, let's see what happens. So in this case, we have register user copy. I should have changed the name as the first thing, but I did not. So in the description, I should name this to login user. And now if I run this again, let's see what happens. So if I save this, you can see that the user does not exist. What are we sending in the body? SN and demo123. Now notice that every time we restart the server, all of this goes away. And that is because this is in memory. This temp DB is created or is created with an empty array every time we restart the server. So without restarting the server, I can now create my user first. So I can hit send. You can see that we got the user back with a 200, which means this user was created. Now I can try the login. So if I hit send now, you can see that we got the user back, which means this is a success. If I try another user that doesn't exist, you can see that it says user does not exist. Super cool. If I try a wrong password, what happens? It says password is incorrect. So we've got our conditions correctly there. And if I basically pause the right thing here, you can see that it works flawlessly. Now that we have this done, let's do one more thing. If the user is already logged in, we don't need to go to the login page. If the user is not logged in, then we should not be allowed to go to the home page. And now that we have the request session.user already populated, we can actually handle this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my routes/index.js, and in here we are going to put another route here, which is going to be / for index.html. And in here we are going to check if the request session exists. So here we can check if req.session.user. If we have the user, then we send this file, which is index.html. If that's not the case, then we essentially send back the login file. So we can actually reverse this by doing something like this. So if we don't have the user, we do res.redirect, and here we redirect to login in this case. And then it would just take us to the login page because we already have the route defined here. Similarly, if we are on the login page or the register page, or if we try to go there and we are already logged in, then we should go to the home page. So I'm going to change this to req, and then I'm going to put the same condition here, but reversed. So if someone tries to go to login page and already has a session, then they should be redirected to /. Otherwise, they are going to get to login HTML. Similarly, if someone tries to go to register, we are going to have the same condition. If we already have a session, then go to home page. Otherwise, go to register. The one thing that's remaining is you also need to put a return here. Otherwise, the next line would be executed. So we need to put return here, here, and also here. So let's save this now. So if I refresh now, you can see that I'm on the home page. If I try to go to login/login, then it should have actually redirected me to home, but it didn't. So let's see what's going on. So instead of running npm start, I'm now going to start with a VSCode configuration so I can debug this. To do so, you need to go and click run and debug, and then click run and debug. And in here, you need to click Node.js. Once you do so, it would run this in debug mode, and you can see that it is running node.exe bin www, and now you should also see this here. And this means that now I can put breakpoints, so I can click here and then also here. And now let's see what happens when we go to the browser. So now I'm gonna just refresh this, and you can see that here it's just loading because we now have this breakpoint activated. So if I go to my VS Code here, you can see that in here we have the request. So I can go request.session, and this session is having no user property, right? So if I'm on login, this user is undefined. So this is supposed to not go there, which is fine. And this is now redirecting us to login, which is also good. Now let's see if we go to home, what happens. So I'm gonna go and just hit enter. And in this case, you can see that it didn't really go to our backend. And that is because if I go to my app.js, I believe our static is being passed before the other ones. Yes. So what we need to do is to remove or to cut this static command or express.static from here to put it after the routes, so just before the app right here. So if it doesn't find any of these routes, then it's gonna go and serve the files accordingly. So I'm just gonna restart the server because we're running Node here with the debugger and not Nodemon. And now that we have restarted it, I can go back and hit refresh. And now you can see that we have a loader running here. So if I go to VS Code, now the breakpoint is triggered. And now I can go forward. So in here, we don't have request session user. So it's going to take me to the login page. And now if I hit play, you can see that it goes to login page and then it goes forward and then serves the login file. So if I go back to my page now, you can see that if I go to home page, it redirects now us to login, which is super cool. Now that we have this, we're not going to be using the front end anymore. We're going to mostly use VS Code, and we're going to essentially implement all the API routes that we have. We're going to start with login, but with the database. So far, we are saving everything in just here in the temp database in the auth file right here, but we actually need a database where we can store this user information. So we are going to now connect to our MongoDB database, and to do so you need to install MongoDB first. So what I want you to do is to go to mongodb.com, and there you're going to essentially go to community server for installing it. So you can go to products, community server, and then here you can find the available downloads based on the platforms that you have. And then once you download, you can essentially install that. Once you're done with that, you can go to your terminal and just try to create a new one. So I can create a new one here. And then what you can do is just run the command mongo sh, and essentially this would start the Mongo service. And then it also connects to the databases that are available at the moment. So here you can see that we are connected to the test database at the moment. What I could do is I could say show databases, and here we would see all the databases that we have. This best language is the database that we are going to create and use. So first of all, I'm going to just say use best-language, and then you can see it switched to it. And then I could basically say show collections and see if there's anything there. I have my data from the previous one, so I'm just going to do db.drop database right now. Actually, this is weird, so I can do this again. So db.drop database now, and then this is dropping the database. So you don't need to do this, especially not when you're working with production databases, but essentially I can now go ahead and use some other database. You remember that we used an extension for MongoDB, right? We can actually utilize that. When we run the mongo sh command, it also shows us the connection string. This is running on localhost 27017. And then we also need to specify the databases as well. So I'm going to copy this from here. Then I'm going to create a new file. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file. So I'm going to close this Redis Explorer, and then I'm going to go ahead and close all of the files as well, just like this. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this dbconnect.js, and then I'm going to essentially write some code here. But before that, I'm going to go to env, and here I can say mongodb URL, and here I'm going to paste this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to install a package called Mongoose, because that's what we are going to connect our backend to MongoDB. So I'm going to do npm install mongoose, and then what we need to do is this. We're going to say const mongoose equals require and then mongoose, And then once we are done with this, we can basically say mongoose.connect, and then we can say process.env.mongodb/url, and then here we can say catch e. In this case, we can essentially go ahead and say something like console.log could not connect to MongoDB. Now, if this fails, we are going to get this error. If it doesn't, then we are not going to see any error at all. But this is a different file. This is dbconnect, and we are not using this dbconnect anywhere in our code base at the moment. I'm going to stop the server for now. And now what I can do is I can go and in the app.js at the very top, I can essentially import this file. So I can say something like require, and I can say slash or /dbconnect, and this essentially exports a function. So we should be saying something like module.exports, and here we can essentially provide a function and run this inside here. Now we can also return this actually to make it a promise. So now that we have this, we can go to app.js and then just run this like this, and we are good to go. Now, if I run the npm start command, if I see any error with MongoDB, then that means we are not connected with that. One more thing that we are going to do, as I mentioned before, is we are going to use this connection string to connect with the VS Code extension. So I'm going to go ahead. Actually, did I change something? Yeah, I did. So I'm going to copy this from here, save this, and then I'm going to go to the MongoDB extension, just like this, click add connection, and here I can say connect. You can provide the whole URL here. So I can say this, hit enter, and now you can see that it says connected to localhost 27017. If I click here, I can find all the databases. So here I can click local, and then we have the databases here as well. Now that we have the MongoDB connected, we are going to save our users once they sign up into the database. So now we are actually going to get into the fun stuff. So in this particular situation, we are going to first create a folder. We are going to call this models. And then inside here, we are going to create a file called user. So imagine that in SQL, we have a table for a database. In MongoDB, we have a collection. Mongoose basically helps us to have sort of a model which defines the schema. By default, MongoDB is a document database, so you can essentially save anything, anyhow, or any way you want. The same collection or table in SQL, when used in MongoDB, for example, if you're using a collection or talking about a collection, can have two different kind of objects, different kind of properties. This doesn't usually happen in SQL, but it's possible in MongoDB or document databases. But this Mongoose basically helps us create a schema so we are checked and we don't make stupid mistakes. So we are going to start with saying const mongoose equals require, and then we can say mongoose here. Then what we are going to do is to create a schema. So we can say const user schema, and then here we can say new mongoose dot schema, and then here we define the schema for this user. We already saw that the user contains the username and password only, so we are going to use those. So username is going to be of type string. The second field here would be required. So required should be true, and also unique true. So we don't have multiple users with the same username, and they should be unique. Then the second one is password. So this is also going to be of type string. And then this also should be required. And then we shouldn't have anything else in this particular case. Finally, if we want our schema or our model to have timestamps, for example, created and updated, we can say timestamps, and here we can say true. And this would essentially add a couple of metadata whenever we save a new object or a new user. Now that we have this, we can create the model. So we can say something like const user equals, and here we can say mongoose dot model. And now you can define the model. You have to use the name like this in Pascal case, and also make sure that you're not using plural here, because it automatically converts this into a plural. And the second thing is going to be schema. So you're passing the user schema. So you're telling Mongoose to create a model named user using the user schema that we have just defined. And finally, you need to do module.exports equals user. So we are exporting the user model that we can now use anywhere. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead into Auth.js, and instead of saving this into the temporary database, we are going to save this into real database MongoDB. So for registration, we are going to go ahead and first check it into the database. And then also if it's not found, then we are going to essentially pass this there. So I'm going to basically mark this function as async, and I'm also going to use an arrow function here for the ease. So I can do something like async. And in there, we are going to use, instead of tempdb, we can say something like await. And then I could say user. And notice that we are importing this from the right folder, which is models/user. And once we get the user here, I could basically say user.find. And in here, I can find it by the username. So I can basically say user name. And if we find a username, or if we find a user with the username, then we essentially get the existing user. And I could actually use find one instead of find. If this is an existing user, we find it, we send this message back just like before. If not, then we go ahead and we try to save or create a new user. So to do that, we could say something like new user, and here we can say something like new user. And here we can essentially pass the username and password just like this, as you can see. Then what we need to do is we need to use the user.save method. So here now we can say try, and here we have to create a new user. So we can say const new user equals to await and new user. So we are using the same user model to create this, and we are now passing the username and password right here. And if all goes okay, then we do something. Otherwise, if there's a catch or if there's an error, essentially we send back that particular error in this case. So in the case of success, what we would do is we are going to do the same thing. So in this case, we are going to say request.session.user equals to this new user that we've got. Then what we are going to do is we are going to return back the user as it is. We should not be sending back the password, so be mindful of that. But before sending this, I can basically say delete new user.password. So we don't really send back a user that has a password in this case. Now that we have this, let's talk about the error. In the case of error, we should essentially say res.status. In here, we can say 400, and then the same thing that we just did. So we can say something like .json, and here we can say something like message e.message. Okay, so the error.message, or you could also say error.message. Now that we have this, I think we are good to go. So I'm going to just save this now, and then let's try this out via Rapid API. So I'm going to go ahead to the Rapid API, and in here, I'm going to go to the register user, and let's try this out. So if I hit send now, you can see that we get the user, but with a unique thing, that is the ID. And this ID essentially tells us that now this has been saved to the MongoDB. How do we know? Well, we don't have to leave VS Code thanks to the extension. So I'm going to go to MongoDB now, and in here, I'm going to just go to local, and here, let's see if I can find it. I may have to just right click and refresh this. So we get this test database, and then here we have users, and inside the users, we should be having the data saved into the database, but we're not really having that. If I hit send again, you can see that I can save this as many times as possible, which means that this is not being used in the database. Let's see what's missing here. So we got the username here, password here, both are required, timestamps are true, but this is not being saved into the database. So I'm going to go back and do live debugging here. Let's see if I can go to the DB Connect here. So we got Mongoose here, we're connecting it. And then we got the Auth.js where we are getting the user from the model. Oh, now I see what's missing. Instead of just relying on the user, we also need to do .save so we can save this into the database. We did not use save. So I'm going to just save this now and then try it again. So if I hit send now, you can see that now we not only get the ID, but the created ad and updated as well. We also got the V here, which is the version. And now if I try to hit send again, it's gonna cause some problem. One more thing that I want to do before we go even further from here is that I want to specify the database name. So in here, I can create a variable called MongoDB database. And here we can specify it as best-languages because that's what we are trying to do in this case. So MongoDB database, and I'm going to save this, and then I'm also going to restart the server because it has to get this env file. So if you don't restart your server, it's not going to get the .env files anymore, or the new variables essentially. Now that we have this, I can go to db connect and I can essentially also just do this. So we can say something like mongo const database url equals, and I can essentially do this. So I can say process.env.mongodb url, and then here I can say slash, and then we can also specify the name of the database. So process.env.mongodb database. So if I save this now, we are going to connect to a different database, and once we hit register user, we are going to have a new database. So if I hit send now, I'm going to close this, hit send. This says user already exists, and that is because we are not connecting to the right database, most likely. Let's see if I can. Oh, because I did not use it. So I have to use the database URL instead of all of this. I'm going to save this, and now I can try this again. So I hit send, and now you can see that we got the new user. If I go to MongoDB here and hit refresh to the connections, or actually not the connections, but rather this connection, then you can see that here we now got best languages. This is the database that we are concerned with. So in here, we can click users. You can see that we got one document here. And if I hit this ID, I can actually see in a new tab the whole document. This is super cool. I can do everything from VS Code. I don't have to go anywhere else. Now let's try logging in. In that particular situation, we have to write some more code. And one more interesting thing is that when we send this, it sends us back the password as well. This is interesting because I think I deleted the password, but it did not. So I'm going to go back to the code and see what happened. So I'm going to go to VS Code Debugger. So I'm going to just go here and see what's going on. In this particular situation, when we have the Auth.js, in here, we should have the new user password deleted, and then we should be sending this back. Although it seems like it's not doing that. So let's say we do something like this. So we say saved user, and then here we can say something like saved user, and then we can do const something like password and user, and then we say saved user. Now this is a really good technique if you want to get rid of a property and then just have everything in the rest one. So this is now called user. I don't need to use this, and I can also remove this, which means that this should send back the registered user correctly. And we are not using password so far, but we are going to use password later on. Now if I save this, try this again, this would say user already exists. So what I could do is I could just maybe delete this. The way to delete this from the MongoDB extension would be to create a playground. So you're going to click new playground, and here it generates some file for you. We don't really need all of this code, so I'm gonna actually remove all of this. Just use the right database. So we had best languages as the database name. And what I could do is I could basically say best or db.users.drop. So in this case, I'm just going to run this. So I'm just going to save this file by doing control save, and then I'm going to give this a name, and I'm going to save this inside Node Redis Auth, which is the root of the file. So in here, I can say something like playground.mongodb. When we do this, this is going to start showing this inside the playgrounds here. And now you can basically click this and come back to this anytime. So I can select this and run using this play button, or I could essentially just click somewhere else, not select anything, and everything would run now. So if I hit play here, you can see that it says, are you sure you want to run this playground? I'll say yes. And that would mean that we got the response back from this whole query. Now we have dropped the user database. And if I try to register again, you can see that it says cannot access password before initialization. This is interesting. And that is because our code is actually using a password here and here as well. So instead of doing that, I could simply say const user equals saved user to JSON. And then I can use this user to assign here. And then I can delete user.password in this case. And then I should be passing this user back to the JSON. So let's save and then try this out. So I'm going to go ahead and run this again. So we run this, we drop the collection, and then we run this again. And now you can see that we didn't get the password back in the API call, which is good. This is what we really want. And if I try to send this again, obviously it would say user already exists. Now let's talk about something interesting. If I go ahead, refresh the database and look at the best languages DB where we have this document, you see that the password is saved in plain text. This is a mistake. This should not happen. We should always be saving encrypted passwords in the database and not plain text. So in order to do so, we are going to use a tool called bcrypt so we can sort of encrypt the password before it is saved. So we are going to go to our terminal and we are going to install a new package called bcrypt. So I can say npm install and then bcrypt, and then we are going to use it inside the user.js. So here we can say const bcrypt, and here we can say equals require, and here we can say bcrypt. Then what we need to do is we could either do it here in the auth.js that before saving we encrypt the password, but a better way would be to do it on a model level. And here you can basically see what are the methods that we can assign to a particular schema. So on the schema level, I could define a method. So I could say user schema dot pre, and there is an event that we can provide this. So pre-save, we are going to execute a function. In here, what we actually get, and here we should not be using arrow function because we would need the concept of this in here, or the context of this, which is essentially the newly saved object. So in this case, when we define this function, we also get the next function that we could call, which is the API call. I'm going to take you through this via debugger so you understand more about this. But essentially, when we have this here, we can check if this user that we are saving right now is already modified or not, or the password field has been set or not, because a user can be updated, in which case it is being saved as well. So we only want to do this once when the user is being registered. So we can put a condition here called this.isModified, and this will return true if this new value that we are getting for this particular path is changed. So when we are basically saving a new object into the database, there we are changing the password. If we update a user password, then it's going to be modified. So if it's not modified, then we don't really need to do anything. We don't need to encrypt anything. If this is not modified, we are going to just call the next function, which means that we are passing it to the route handler. But if that's not the case, then we do something different. So here we can just say return next. Otherwise, we change the password. So we can say this.password equals bcrypt.hashsync. And here we can provide this.password. And this.password is the one that is being saved. For example, in our case, it was, I believe, demo123. So we are going to get demo123 here. We are going to hash it, and we are going to assign it to this.password. And in here, we can provide how many number of iterations we can pass here. So I'm just going to provide salt rounds as 12. And I think that should be good. You need to remember that in any of these cases, the next function should always be called. So I'm going to call the next function here. So we are good. Now that we have this, let's debug this and try this out. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here, and I'm also going to go ahead and going to register in this case, and I'm going to put a breakpoint here as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the database again for the user. So I'm going to hit play here. Yes. And we should get a true here in this case. And then I can go and click run and debug. You need to make sure that you are either on the app.js file so you can run the server, or another better way would be to create a launch JSON. So you can click create a launch JSON, click Node.js, and in here you can see the default program bin www. So you can just save this and you can click launch program now. So it doesn't matter now which file you are at the moment. You can click launch program and it will run Node.js bin www. So here, if I go to debug console, you can see that it's running the right file. So we are good there. Now I can go to register user and hit send. If I do this, you can see that we are still in VSCode. It comes to the register page. Here we're getting the request body, which has the username as and the password. You can also see all of those things in here inside the watch. So you're going to check request.body, hit enter, and you can see that we get the password and the username right here. Then if I go forward, it tries to find the user via the username. So it tries to find existing user. You can see that we don't have existing user. We get a null there. Then it moves forward. It does not go inside this because the user doesn't exist. Then we are creating a new user. Once we use the model here, as you can see, it's a model. We create a new user, which is a save user. And as soon as we try to save, it comes inside this schema pre-save function. Now here you can see that the next is essentially a function, which is technically this same function. So it goes forward out of this. And here you can see that we are talking about this. Now this is the document that is being saved right now. This is modified is a function that will either return a true or false. And if I go to this, you can see that we have a username here, which is there, but the password has not been set yet because we are checking it right now and it's a pre-save function. So if I go forward here, you can see that now we're using bcrypt #sync and we're providing the password here, which is demo123 running 12 round of salts to is. And if I go forward from here, you can see that we got the password, which is right now encrypted. Now, if I hit next, it will essentially go back to our file. So if I go back to auth, maybe I can go and put a breakpoint here. So if I play, now you can see that it came with the saved user, which is the document that is now saved to the database because it's already saved. Now it goes and converts this into a JSON. So we just get the version and not the methods and whatnot, just the plain JavaScript object or JSON object with the username and the password. Now we go ahead, assign this to request session user, and then we delete the password. So this user does not contain the password now, and then it returns it back. So we get it back into our extension, but it seems like the request timed out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this again, hit play. And now you can see that we have the message that this user already exists. So I can basically go again in MongoDB in the playground and try to basically destroy it or drop the database. I could do all of this again and again and again. But what I want to focus on is now on to the login side. How do we log in using this whole situation? So we got an encrypted password within the database. For logging in, we should find the user in the database and see if the user exists or not. So in order to do that, first, I'm going to convert this into an ES6 function as well. Then I'm going to go and say async. So we can use async await. Now, instead of all of this, I could basically do await user.find1. And here I'm going to find by username, of course. Once we get the user, or if we don't get a user, then we say user does not exist. Super cool. Then we don't really need to do this, but rather we are going to check it using bcrypt because the password that is saved within the database is not exactly what the user is providing. So we need to use the bcrypt package here. So in order to do so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another function here in this user.js. And this one is a bit different from this pre-hook. This is sort of a middleware function, but rather this one that we are creating is a method on the schema level. So here we are going to say user schema dot, and here we are going to say methods dot, and then we create something called compare password. So we are creating another helper function that we can access anytime. This is going to receive a password. We can essentially pass anything here, but we are just going to pass the password and return true or false if it matches or not. So we are going to return bcrypt. So this is a bcrypt method dot compare. And then we also have a compare sync. So we are going to use the sync one. And here the first one is essentially the password. So we are going to say password. And then the second one should be the user password. So it should be this dot password. Once we have this, we don't really need to connect all the models and whatnot. So I can just save this one here, and then I can go to auth.js. And in here, I can simply compare them using this. So I can say here existing user dot compare password. And here I can essentially go ahead and pass the password here. So I can say password here, and that's pretty much it. If it returns a false, we say password is incorrect. Otherwise, we do the rest of the things. So in the case of finding the existing user and the password being matched, what we need to do is this const. Here we can say user equals, and here we can say existing user dot to JSON. And then we are going to say delete user.password because we don't really want to send this back. Now there's another way to not have a password from the database itself by passing password to 0, but we really need in this query the password so we can compare it. So we cannot really do this here, but rather we need to delete the user password from here. Then we need to assign this to request.session.user and then also then pass this along to the REST API as a response. So I'm going to save this now and let's try this out. I'm going to go to Rapid API and here I'm going to go to register and then also I'm going to open the login call. So before we call this, let's quickly run and debug this again. So I'm going to start this. And now that we are running this, I could basically go to register user, hit send, and now it comes in here. If I hit play, it says user already exists. We are good there. Now let's also put some breakpoints into login. So if I hit here, then I would also go here and then here and then here as well. Now for login, let's see the whole flow. So in body, I'm going to change the username to sn22, hit send, and here you can see that we got the breakpoint. If I go ahead, we got the username as sn22, we got the password. So it's trying to find the user. The existing user does not exist. So it goes forward and it returns this back. Now you can see here it says request timeout, but I can just send, play, and you can see that here we got the user message here. I believe there should be a way to increase the timeout as well, but I have not looked into it yet. So now that we have this, let's have a look at the other use case where the password is incorrect. So if I say demo1234, what happens in that case? So I hit send, it comes here, we go forward, we find the user, the existing user exists, as you can see. So we move forward, and here we are using the compare password method. Now it will go inside the function with the password, which is demo1234, and the this.password is undefined there. So it's going to just run this, and it's undefined because I have made this as an arrow function. So that's bad of me. So I'm going to convert this back into a function, not an arrow function. That's the helpful debugging that we all really want. So I'm going to launch the program now, and then I'm going to try logging in again. So I'm going to click send. It's going to go ahead, and then it's going to go inside the compare password. Here now the this.password should exist. As you can see, it's using bcrypt compare sync with this password and the password that we are providing. It's going to provide this as false. So this is not the right password, and therefore we should get passwords incorrect. So if I go ahead, hit send, hit play, you can see that we get the password is incorrect. Super cool. Now finally, in the case of success, let's see what happens. So I'm gonna say sn demo1234, or actually 123, and hit send. In this case, it comes here, goes forward, and actually passes all of these things because the password is correct, the user exists. So now we convert this into a JSON. We get the user here with everything and the password. We go forward. The password is removed from the object, and then we send it back. So I'm going to just hit this again, send, play, and now hit play. And you can see that we get the user. So the login and register are working perfectly fine. We save the user, we get everything back, and now everything looks good. Now let's try to implement this into the UI as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to public and I'm going to go to login.html. So if I go to login here, I can see JavaScript HTML request, but I can also see code for fetch, jQuery, and XUS. So I'm going to use fetch in this case. I'm going to copy the code from here and then go to login.html. And in here, I can essentially paste the code here just like this. As you can see that I actually saved a lot of time just by doing this. So we got localhost 3000 auth login. Now I don't really need localhost 3000 because I'm going to run it right from the server. So I can just say /auth login, but the rest of this looks good. Now we need the values from the inputs here. So that's what we are going to do now. So in this case, what we want to do is we already have a form and the ID is login form in this case. So I could go ahead and put some code here right after this console log. So I could say something like document dot get element by ID, and then here the ID is login form dot add event listener, and in here we can essentially say submit. Once this is submitted, we can get an event inside here, and then we can say e.prevent default. So we are not submitting the form by the default behavior of the browser. And then what we need to do is to get the form element itself. So we can say const form equals e dot target, which is essentially the form element, which we have here. And then we can get the values for the form elements from here. And then we can do something like const username equals to form dot elements. And here we can provide the name here. And now this name essentially is what we have here in the property. So the name here is email, but the ID is username. So I can either use the name or the ID. I would rather use the ID in this case. So I'm going to go ahead, or actually we should probably change the name as well to username in this case. So we can say username, and here we can go ahead and use the username property here. Similarly, we have password here. So we can say form.elements, and here we should have the password as well. Once we have that, we can essentially use the on form submit to pass both of those things, username and the password. Now that we are passing this, we can basically copy this just like this, and then we can pass it here or expect these to come as an object. And then what we can do is we can json.stringify this. So we can say json.stringify, and then we have the username and the password. So I can copy this, paste this here, and I can remove this line. Now we are going to debug this, so you would see all of this working actually in action. And now we need to do a couple of things. So first of all, what we need to do is to convert these then into await, because we are using async here. So we are going to get a response here. So we can say const resp, and here we can say await. And then all we need to do is not to have this, but we also have then catch here. So I think there are going to be a lot of variables here. So let's say this is called response. Then what we need to do is to have const body equals to resp.json. And then we also would have other things, but I'm going to remove this code from here. Since I'm using async await, I'm going to do a try here and then just put all of this here. Then if we have a catch, we are going to handle it in a better way right here, but let's put it later. Now that we've got body, we are going to check if the body exists and if the body has user in it. And if we got that, we can simply say window.location.href equals to slash, which means we are redirecting to home page in this case. And in case of error, all we need to do is to alert e.message. So whatever message is there, we are going to just alert with this. So I'm going to save this now and let's try this. Now we actually have to go to our browser to see if login works out of the box. So it looks like it is going towards our breakpoints. So I'm going to just disable all the breakpoints for now. Or I could actually remove all those as well, but it's fine for now. I'm going to restart the server as well so we can check the login call as well. And now if I go to my browser, I can debug this and see what's happening in the inspector. So I'm going to go ahead and go to sources, login, and I'm going to put some breakpoints in the script. So on form submit, we got this const options. Then we got try catch here that we need to work with. And we also got this here. So now if I put these value sn, and here I can say demo123 because that was the password. So if I hit login here, you can see that it comes here with in the login form when it's submitted, because we are handling the submit method here. Then it goes forward and takes out the form. So this is the form element that we are talking about. So if I mouse over it, you can see that the whole form is being highlighted, which has inputs and then a button. Now if I go forward and take out the username, you can see that we got the username input here and then the password input as well. But we should have got their values out. So we are rather using the username and password here. So we should have those values out. So I'm going to go back to my code and go to login.html, and instead of just passing them like this, we should have username. And also, by the way, these should be rather value. So I can shorten this down, something like this, so I don't have to modify this guy. So I can save this now. Let's try this again. I'm going to refresh. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the code is updated. Here I can see the value now. And now if I hit login, it's going to go ahead. And now we got the username value, which is SN. The password here is different. It's click123. So it's not going to work, but we'll still get something out of it. So if I go forward here, you can see that it gets username as password. It basically constructs all the options. So in this option, we got the body, which is stringified. We got the headers, we got the method, and we also have the URL here. already. Now it goes ahead and basically makes the API call. You will see that we get response which says bad request, and in here the status is 400. And if I go to the body, essentially this would show an error message, but we are going to convert this response or take out the JSON out of it. Here you can see that we got the body, which is a promise pending, because I made a stupid mistake of not putting a wait here. So let's quickly save this, refresh, and now we are going to see if this works. So hit login, goes forward, 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 and now it's going to go ahead and convert this into JSON. And now you can see body, that is a message, and that is password incorrect. So if I move forward, hit play, you can see password is incorrect. Similarly, if I try a user which is not existing, it's going to alert that the user does not exist. So we are good here. We're submitting this into the right form. Now, if I go ahead and try to successfully do it, let's see what happens. I'm going to say demo 1, 2, 3. I'm going to hit login. It's going to go ahead, go forward, and now this time it has a success. So we have status 200, status test is okay, and now the body should also contain the information. So if I go forward here, you can see the body contains a user now, and this is what we are checking going forward. So first of all, if the body has user, then we are redirecting on the front end to slash, and then if I hit play, you can see that it takes us to home. Now this is important. You can see that here we are taken to home automatically, but if I was not logged in, even then I could go to home, and we are going to check it out in a bit. But before that, let's implement the logout functionality, right? In order to do so, you go into your auth.js, routes auth.js, and in here we are also going to put a new route. We are going to make it a get route, and this is going to be log out. And in here, all we need to do is to just do req.session.destroy. And if you hover over it, you can see that this is sort of a callback that you get. And in this case, it could either be an error or success. So we are going to assume that it's all going to be good. So even if there's an error, we are going to say if there's an error, then we do return res.status 400.json, and here we can provide the message. So we can say something like message, and here we can say error.message. And then if that's not the case, then we are just going to return a success in this case. So we can say something like res.status 200, and then JSON should be just a success true. So we can say success true in this case. Or we are actually using this a get route, so we can use redirection in this case. So we can do rather in this case of success, we can say rest.redirect to the login page, right? And I think that should be good. So now all we need to do is to check the logout function. If I go to index.html and if I try to find logout, not there, but rather here, you will see that on click of logout, we already have this auth logout href here. We don't really need an on-click function here, so I'm going to remove this. So all we need to do is to just go to this page, which should trigger this logout method, and then the rest should be good. So I'm going to restart the server so we have these changes in place. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my browser and I'm going to refresh, and I'm now going to click logout. So if I click logout, it essentially goes to the logout page, which means that in our VS Code, now we have this triggered. Now this is trying to destroy the session which already has the user. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here inside and here as well. So if I hit play, you will see that we don't get any error. It's null. So it's not going to go inside this, and it's going to go forward with the success redirect to login. So if I hit play, you can see that we are automatically redirected to login, which is absolutely good. So if I try to go through this whole flow, having this debugger disabled, let's see how this looks like. I log in, it essentially gives me an error if the password is incorrect. So I type the correct password, demo123, hit login again, and you can see that now I'm automatically redirected to this page. Now if I log out, I'm automatically redirected to the login page. Super cool. Now the same thing can be done for the register scenario. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all of the things that I have inside here in the login page, and I'm going to paste that in the register page. So I'm going to just copy this. Something is weird. So we have this script, and then we have the interesting part is that this script is outside the body, which should not be the case. This should be inside the body. And then there should be some sort of indentation outside here. So we are really missing something here. Yeah. So this should look like this. Yeah. Now I can copy this script completely, and then I can go to register.html, and I can also remove this script and just paste the copied one. And now I need to change just the URL to register. In this case also, we have the same code, the same logic, just the form ID is going to be different. So it's registration form. So I'm going to replace this with the registration form. And then also I'm going to make sure that the username is the name here as we did for before. But I think rest of this should actually be okay. So I'm going to just save this and try this out. So let's go to register. I'm going to also restart the server. And now if I go to sign up, let's try creating a new user that has not been created before. So first I'm going to go to my MongoDB instance. I'm going to just reload to see what's there in the database. So in the best languages users, we only have one document, and that is essentially SN. So I'm going to create another user here. So the next user is going to be, let's say, Mohsin, and I'm going to provide the same password, demo123, and I'm going to hit register in this case. So if I hit register, this should all go through the same process, but I'm going to put breakpoints so I can see what's working. So I can click here, I can also click here, and I can also click here. So if I hit register now, you can see that it goes here to the prevent default, takes out the form correctly without any issues, takes out the username and password as well, then goes to on form submit, creates these options, and then the URL is auth register. And then we wait for the response. So I'm going to go ahead and click here. So we wait for the response. The body contains user, which is just now created. And now we go and redirect the user to home automatically. And when we go to home page, we then should see other things as well, but we are good for now. Now that we have this, we need to make sure that the login page is not accessible if the user is not logged in. To do that, I'm going to go to the index.js. And in here, we already made sure that if we don't have a user, it's not accessible. That's cool. So all I need to do now, if I log out, I can go to the login page. If I try to go to home page, you can see that it redirects us to the login page, which is really good. So we don't have to worry about it. And if I'm logged in, for example, with the correct account, demo123, then if I try to go to rather login page, it takes me back to the home page. So I think we are covered there. Now let's try to finalize some stuff. We need these languages to be there so we can select favorite from there. Then we also need the information of what is my favorite language. So there are a couple of API calls that we are going to build. So we are going to start building it right now. So I'm going to close everything because I need a fresh start. So I'm going to refresh now. And now what I'm going to do is also to go into the routes folder. And here we are going to create another route for languages. So I'm going to create a file called it languages.js. In here, we are going to have only one route, which returns a list of all the languages so we can show that. But before that, obviously, we need to create a model here as well. So we can say language.js. And we are also going to import this route into app.js. So I'm going to go to app.js, and similar to however we are importing auth router, I'm going to copy paste and say languages here. And then we have languages router, and I'm going to use it just like this here. So we can say app.use and then languages, and then we are going to provide the languages router just like this. Now that we have this, let's see how the languages router looks like. Now for this one, we can have a hard-coded languages array that we could use. So we don't even need the model for this case, but that would then not teach you a couple of things about how we work with databases and relations in Node.js. So for the programming languages, what we want to do is to have a seed, which means that we can populate our database with a bunch of languages. And To do so, we should still have a model. So first of all, let's create that model. Here, we are going to do the same thing as the user model, but a bit different. So in here, we don't need bcrypt. We also don't need these functions, but we do need some languages here. So not even timestamps. They're not really important in this case. So we are going to say languages schema here. And in here, we are also going to call this language in this case. And then a language should have a name, which is required. It should also be unique. And then it should have an icon URL, which we could say is required in this case. Yeah, I think we could say that. So in this case, we got the languages schema and we can use this and export the language variable as well, just like this. So we can use it everywhere else. Now what we are going to do is we are going to use the same thing as Auth.js. So I'm going to copy this, go to language.js, and then remove everything apart from the one route that we already have in this case. And then I'm going to remove the tempdb in this case. Also, I think we should be removing it from the Auth.js as well. We are not really using that. We can also convert these variables to const. That would be awesome. Not to see var at all. And then also we don't need user in languages. So we are going to just have a get call here with a slash. And then all we need to do is to just return back. So we can do something like const languages equals, and then we can say something like language, which is being imported from models language, which is correct. And this should be async. So we have a wait here, and then we can essentially just do find and then an empty object inside. Once we get this, we can simply say res.status 200.json, and here we can say languages. And I think that's pretty much it. So this should work perfectly fine out of the box. So I'm going to restart the server just to make sure we don't have any issues. So the debug console is clear at the moment. So I'm going to go to app.js. We are already using languages, which is good. So we already have this working. So I'm going to open Rapid API now and create another route here. So we can say something like get all languages. So get all languages. This is going to be a get call. I'm going to use the environment variable, which is base URL here /languages. And now if I hit send here, you can see that we get languages as an empty array. So there are no languages in the database at the moment. One more thing that we could do is we could also have this middleware that we can set to have no languages being retrieved if the user is not logged in. So we can protect our routes. So we can say something like a new folder, we can say middleware, and here we can say something like user logged in, or we could say something like auth.middleware.js. In here, we can essentially create a function. So we can say const is logged in, and here we should be receiving request, response, next. And in this case, we are going to just say something like this, module.exports equals is logged in. So in this case, we are going to say if the request dot session dot user does not exist, then we basically send back an error that not authenticated, or maybe we could say, yeah, is authenticated, for example, or authenticated. I think that should be good. Now that we have this, we can basically say return res dot, or actually do res dot status. We could say something like for one, and here we can say JSON message. Here we can say something like not authorized. Now that we have this, I think what we can do is return from here. So the next function is never called. Otherwise, we should have the next function being called. And I think that should be it. Now what I can do is I can go to the language call to here. So we can go to routes, languages, and here I could basically say authenticated. And I think that should be good. So this should receive the request and the response in this case. We're not using the request in this function, so I'm going to change this to underscore, and I can now save it. If I refresh now and go to get all languages and hit send, you will see that it says not authorized, and we have 401 as well. So that is because the VS Code extension is not a browser. So it doesn't have a cookie, it cannot have a session. That's why it's always going to be unauthorized. There are further APIs as well, which we may want to protect if we want the user to be, if we want the user to not access it. So if we talk about auth here, the login and register, both of them are requests where we do want them to access it, but there could be another call where the user just wants their data. And in that case, we should also be protecting that. But we are going to go into that in a bit. But this URL at the moment is protected. So we can see that there are no languages, or we can see that this is not authorized at the moment. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and for this auth middleware, I'm just gonna comment this out so we can test this, but I'm going to put it back later on, I promise. Now that we have this, I can restart the server and I can click send, and you can see that we have no languages whatsoever here. Now what we are going to do is we are going to put some languages in the database. So in here, I got a really nice project by Abraham Kalv, which is programming languages logos. So he essentially has a logo file for all of the programming languages. And what I basically ended up doing is just automating this. So first of all, go here and give this repository a star, because obviously this deserves it. And then follow my lead for basically automating this, which is super cool. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a seed file, which is going to run only once. So when we deploy our application to a new environment, we can essentially run this once to populate all those files. But we are doing this in the database. So that would mean that it is also possible for us to add more directly in the database so the app can start using it. So in this case, I'm going to create a new file called dbseed.js. And one more thing that we need to do is you need to go to the gist route again, or the gist address again. And then here we have a file called languages from github.json. So I've actually converted what this repository had to an object that I can use within the project. So you can basically copy the name of the file as well. Go here and go inside to create a folder. We are going to call this data. And inside here, we would have a file called languages from github.json. Then you need to copy all of this and then just paste it here. So you can see that the keys are essentially the names of the languages, and the value is just shortened version of it. But it's not just anything. It's actually the key to all the images that this repository has. For example, let's talk about C#. In this case, this says C#. So if I go to this GitHub repository, go to source, you can see we have a C# folder here. And that is what I'm going to use to get an image from this repository. And we can use this then in our code. So I'm going to go to my code again and go to dbseed.js. Now this script is going to run apart from our backend, which means this is a standalone JavaScript file, which means that it won't have mongoose or anything as such. So we need first to connect the database and then also to run mongoose. So this is a separate script that should run separately. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use dbconnect file to connect to the database. So I'm going to first go ahead and say something like const dbconnect equals require, and I'm going to require it just like this. And once we have this, we can essentially just keep it here for now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to also import file system or FS, so we can also do some crazy calculations there with file system. I'm also going to import the language model, but also I'm going to import the path. So I'm going to say const require path here. And now let's talk about it. So since we have this dbconnect function, we can essentially get this promise out of the connect method, so we can do something after it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an immediately invoked function, or we call it ify or something. So we have this immediately invoked function that is being invoked right here via these two parentheses. This is an async function. So now I can basically run anything inside. So what I'm going to do here is that first I'm going to wait for dbconnect. Once we have the DB connected, then I'm going to do some magic. In this case, first we need to find languages. As I said, this is supposed to only run once when there are no languages in the database. So we are going to make sure that that's the case. So const languages equals await, and here we are going to say language, which is being imported from models. And then here we can say something like find. And then here we can say empty object, which means that it's going to find all the languages and we'll see if they exist or not. So if languages dot length equals to 0, if there are no languages in the database, then we do something, otherwise we don't. So let's say the language's length is 0, then we return. If it's actually not 0, to be precise. So if it's not equal to 0, then we return, otherwise we proceed forward. Now, first of all, we are going to do is we are going to get the JSON file, parse it, and see the data. So we can say something like languages from GitHub JSON equals to, and here we are going to say json.parse because we are going to parse a file. So a file can be retrieved as fs.read file sync. In here, we need to provide the path of the file. So we can say path.resolve. And in here, we can say directory name. So we are in the current directory, which is right now the root directory. And here we can then provide dot slash and here data slash, what was it again? It was languages from github.json. So I can basically copy the name from here, paste it here. And then the second parameter of this fs read file sync is the encoding. So the encoding here should be UTF-8, and that's pretty much it. Now, when we read this file, this is going to be a string. So we are going to parse this into a JSON. So here I can say json.parse and then all of this, and then I can just log it. So I can say console.log, and then I can just put there. Now, if I try to run this script, let's see what happens. In the terminal, I can simply say node and I can say dbc.js. If I run this, you're going to see some errors. That's interesting. So here it says MongoDB parse error, invalid scheme, expected connection string. And that is because the db connect uses these variables which were not provided. So what I need to do is to do this. I need to require the .env file. So here I can say require .env.config, and that should solve the issue. So I can now run this again, dbc.js. Now you can see that we get the contents of the file. So these are being logged now. Now what I need to do is to basically add all of these into the database with the schema or with a data similar to the schema. So we need to have a name and the icon URL for each of these languages. And we already know that the URLs are going to be something like this. So we have 16 by 16, 128 by 128. So if I click this, you can see that this is the URL. So if I right click this and copy link address, I actually get the final URL, which is this. So this is raw github user content.com, blah, blah, blah. And then the folder name and then the URL here. So this is what I'm going to use in my code as well. So now that I have this JSON here from the GitHub JSON, I have read it using the file system. What I can do is I can say languages to add equals to, and here we are going to run a loop over this object. Since this is an object, I can simply say object.keys, and then I can essentially run a loop over it. So I can provide these languages from GitHub JSON, and here I can say dot map. So we return an array out of it with the mapped object. And here I could say something like key, since we are running this loop over the keys. And then I'm going to create some variables. So const name equals to key. And then we also need to identify the icon URL. So I can say const icon key is going to be the languages from GitHub JSON key, which means that every time we talk about the name, it's going to be HTML, for example, or let's say C#, which is the name, but the icon key should be C# because we are going to use the icon key in the URL itself, as I mentioned before. So the C# is going to go here. So we are taking the icon key here, and now let's construct the icon URL. So here we are going to construct it using this. So we are copy pasting all the URL from here, but we are just going to replace this variable where we need to provide the icon key. So in here, you can see that it's exactly the same, but we have this raw master and then icon key and icon key SVG. So you can take a look at this. So it's https://github.com/abrahamkolv, and then programming languages logo, raw master, source, icon key.svg. So we are taking the SVG files out of this. Finally, we need to return the icon URL and name. So you could say name, icon URL, and that's pretty much it. Now that we've got the languages to add, we can just use it to add it to our database. And to do so, we are going to run a try catch. So we can say try here. Then we're going to also have a catch here. In the case of catch, we can just say console.log and we can log the error. But in case of try, what we are going to do is this. We're going to say await language dot insert many, and in the insert many we are going to provide the languages to add, and that's pretty much it. Once we are done, we can just console.log here and we can say something like maybe a rocket, and we can say languages added to the database, woohoo or woohoo. Now we have done this, we can basically go to our terminal and run the node dbc.js. Once we run this, you will see that we should get the message that we have languages added to the database. Super cool. And if I go to my MongoDB extension, I should be able to see that. So if I hit refresh right here, you can see that not only we have users, which are 2 right now. I created Asen and Mosin, I believe. Yep, we have these, but we also have languages. So if I hit languages here, you can see that now we got 17 documents within the database. Super cool. So now if I go back to my REST API call get all languages, and if I hit send now, you can see that we get all the languages in this call. Yay! And now the only thing I think that is remaining is to test that this does not run again. So you could actually put some code in the dbc.js, so maybe a log there. So you could put this right here when we are doing a return. So we can say something like languages already added, stopping the script here, and that should be good. So if I do this here, and I can remove the last console log because that's confusing. So I'm going to just clear this, and then I can run this node dbc.js. If I hit enter, you can see that language is already added, stopping the script here. Finally, one thing to make sure is that after the whole process has been finished, you disconnect from the database. So in here, you can essentially say const connection equals to await db connect, which is essentially a connection. And here, what you could do at the end is something like this. So you could say connection dot disconnect, and that should be good. So in here, I'm just gonna put await here. I believe this returns a promise, or no, maybe no. So if I can put it here, then I should also be putting it here in the condition where we are doing a return. So if I now do dbc.js, you can see that we get the message that they are already added. And we now also have this these languages working as well. Now that we have this, we need to proceed further into also making a language as favorite. And also there's one thing that we needed to do. When we log in, we should also show the username here up top. Right now, we don't do that. So first of all, let's try to implement the call for getting the user data. For this, we are going to do a really simple thing. We are going to go to the routes page and in auth, and here we're going to implement a call for me. So here I'm going to say /me is a URL. And in here, we are going to get the username. So since the user should be logged in here, we are going to essentially go ahead and say something like const username equals req.session.user. And then we are going to find this user and send this back. So we are going to say const user equals await, and here user.find1, and the username would be provided to find the user. Then all we need to do is to just do res.status, and here 200, and then the JSON here should send back a user. And that's pretty much it. Now this me should not be called if there is no session. So we should be using the authenticated middleware here as well. So authenticated, as far as I remember, that was the name of it. So if I go to middleware, it's auth middleware, and authenticated is the one. So I'm going to just put it right here, authenticated, and then import it from the middleware. So I can say const authenticated equals require, and here we have middleware and then auth middleware, and there we go. So now this is protected, and this should only be called if we have this notion where the user is logged in. Now that we have this, we are going to check this out. But in order to check this, we cannot check it from Rapid API because there are no cookie sessions there, but we can definitely run this from the browser. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Rapid API at least to generate the code. Yay, Rapid API client. So in here, I'm going to just go ahead and create another request. I can say environment variable here, just like this, and then /auth/me. In this case, this is going to be a GET request, and I can say get user data. And then if I hit send here, let's see if this works. So first, it is a no response. So I'm going to restart this, make sure that the debug is cool, and then I can send this. And we don't get any data in this case. Let's see JSON tags. It says no response. That's interesting. So we got auth/me, and the auth also has the get/me. Then the res.status is this, and looks like everything should be as it is. So if I hit a breakpoint here, let's see what happens. So if I do send, it doesn't go there at all. Oh, interesting. That is because we have not selected the base URL. Oh, that's why. So now if I hit send, it should come here. It should get the user session if it exists. Otherwise, it would obviously throw an error. So here it says something like username cannot be retrieved, blah, 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 cannot destructure. That is because the request.session.user does not exist. So in this case, it would obviously fail. Authenticated should also check if there is a session or if there is a user, otherwise just send back not authorized. So if I have to run this program again because it's crashed, then I can just hit send. And now it says not authorized because I don't have this session. But what I could do is just copy this and then go to the browser and then open inspector. And then from within this page, I can try to send a call. So here, if I hit send, we should be able to get this data back, I believe. Oh, there's a breakpoint pending. So now here it's going to get the request.session.user, and it gets the username out of it, which is SN. Then it finds the user. It finds the user just like this, and it sends back the user. Yay! In this particular situation, you can see that we got the user with all of the things, including the password. We don't really need the password in this case. So what we are going to do is we are going to give this a second parameter and say password is 0. That means we should not be retrieving it. So I'm going to remove the breakpoint, refresh this, and then we are going to try this call again. So now I'm going to refresh this and then do the same thing again. And now you see that we got this user as an output, and in the network call, we can see the me call. And in here, we see the data and not the password. Super cool. So we have the me call implemented here. Now, the final thing that we want to do is to implement the language call that we can essentially mark as favorite. So for that, we are going to implement a new route, and also we are going to go ahead and change some things in the database as well. So for the models here, we are going to go to the user model, and in here, we are going to define a favorite language. Now, a user could have multiple favorite languages. In that particular case, it is going to be a one-to-many relation, and then we have to decide what is many. Is it too many? Is it not too many? And then we have to decide if we should embed that within the user schema or create another collection and then kind of merge those IDs and whatnot. One interesting thing that we really need to do is, in the end, if we want this to be extensible, maybe we want to show how many people have JavaScript as their favorite, or how many people have C# as their favorite. To do that, we really need to have a new model that we can use. So what we are going to do now is we are going to create a new model. We are going to call it favorite language, and then we are going to start defining it. So for this one, what I'm going to do is define it just like this. So we have the favorite schema. In here, we have the language, which is going to be of type object ID, because this is going to reference this language model. And then the other thing is going to be user, which is also going to be of type mongoose.schema.types object ID. And the reference here is language. In the reference here is user. In this case, you can see that both of these things are required. So we are essentially creating, just like we do in SQL database, that we have a table that defines the relation between those two things. So we have a user ID and then we have the entity ID. So here we have a language and we have the user in this case. And this is marked as favorite. So we are just calling this favorite in this particular case. Now that we have this, we could also say favorite language. But yeah, let's actually call it that. So we can say const favorite language equals, and then we can define it just like this with a semicolon. And then we can also call this favorite language. And then we can export favorite language from here. Now there's a question, where should this URL be? We could have either this stored within the user route. So we have something like user/favorite. So you can essentially assign it there, but I would rather go ahead with a different route. So in here, I'm going to create a new route. So we can say favorite languages, and here we can say JS. And now this needs a couple of routes. So let's create a few routes here. So for this, we are going to obviously import Express for router. So here we are going to import both of those things, just copy pasting here like a pro. And then we also need the models here, but let's basically call out our first route, which is marking a language as favorite for a particular user. So we are going to say router.post, and here we are going to say slash. That is because when we hit this, we are going to hit this with a route called favorite language. So in this case, we are going to say something like this. So we are going to say favorite languages, and here we can say favorite languages router. And here we can import this just like this. So we can say this, and here we can say routes dash favorite languages, and we can say favorite languages router. Did I mess up the old one? I think I did. So I can basically copy paste this just like this, or actually not. Yeah, this should be something like this. Now we have languages router and favorite languages router, and now we do have this here. Let's save this. And now I'm going to go back here and talk about this post thing. So in here, we are going to have an async method. We have a request, response. Then what we are going to do here is that we need to have two things for favorite language. One, we need the language ID. Second, we need the user ID. So here we are assuming that the language is going to be provided in the request body, but the user can be extracted from the session itself. So first of all, this should be authenticated. So I'm going to say something like authenticated. So we are not missing the session here. Now what we do is const, we can say something like user ID, or we could extract it something like this. So we could say ID, user ID equals request.session.user. So we already know that the user has a property called ID. So we are going to call it user ID in this case, or we could also say user, it doesn't really matter. Now we are going to extract the language ID from the body. So the body should contain a language ID in this case, language ID equals, and then we should have req.body in this case. Now, if we don't have the user ID or we don't have the language ID, then we should return res.status 400, and the JSON should just have a message language ID missing. The user ID actually should always be there, so I'm not gonna put it here. I think we are good here. Now what we want to do is to save this information into the database. So we should save this user ID and language ID together. And once we do so, we should actually be checking if the user already has a favorite. If not, then just create it. And if yes, the user already has a favorite, then just update it. So to do that, I'm going to say saved equals await, and then I can simply say favorite language dot find one and update, and it isn't giving me any suggestion, which is super weird, which means that this favorite language is a mongoose model, which looks good, but why isn't it giving me any suggestion? That is interesting. Dot find one and update. So we do find one and update, and in this case we are going to provide it with the language ID. So if we find one or actually the first one should be username. So we should be providing user with user ID. And then the update data should be the language ID. So the user ID obviously is going to be same throughout, but the language ID could change. So the language would be language ID in this case. And then the final thing that we need is to say that this should be an upsert true. I think that's the third parameter that we can give here. So that should be upsert true. And that should be it. Finally, once this saved, we can simply say res.status, and this is going to be 200. And then we can say .json, and the JSON should contain the data or the language that we have just saved. So we can simply say language saved. And now that we have this, or actually we could say something like language, maybe we don't have to do this now. So if I hit save, we should be good. If I hit reload, the server should start again. And now we got an error, and that is because this app.js is behaving weird somehow. So favorite languages router, what is it getting? So this favorite languages router gets the router, but it doesn't export anything. So we should be doing module.exports, and here it should be router that we are exporting. Fair point. Now that we have this, I think this should work. So I'm gonna restart the debugger, and it seems to be working fine. Now that we have this, let's try out the URL. So we hit the favorite language in this case. First of all, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to put a breakpoint here so we can start debugging this. I'm gonna close others, and then I'm going to go to Rapid API to create some routes. So I'm going to go ahead and click plus. In here, we got post, we got the headers here. We can basically say accept application JSON. And then for the body, we can pass the language ID in this case, but we are going to have a look at that later. So first we got the environment. We're going to click the environment, click base URL, and then it's going to be /favorite languages. And then what we need is just a body. Now this is again not really going to work, and that is because we do need this authenticated scenario here, but let's see anyways. So the JSON here could contain, or actually should contain, the language ID. So we can say something like language ID, and here we can hard code it like 123 123. If I hit send, it's going to say not authorized because we are using the authenticated middleware. So I'm going to remove this now. And now let's do one thing. First of all, change the description name to say mark language as favorite. And then what I'm going to do is I'm first going to get all the languages. So we have get all the languages. And if I hit send, I can see not authorized. So I also need to mark that one as well. So I can go to languages and remove authenticated for now at the moment. So I can get all the languages. I also have to restart the server, click, and now I get all the languages. Now I'm going to do this for the user, which is SN, and I'm going to mark the file JavaScript or the JavaScript language as the favorite. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my MongoDB, and I'm also going to have a look at the document there to get the user. So first of all, mark as favorite is going to require the language ID, which is this one. And also it would have to have the user ID as well, which we take from the session. Now that's going to be really interesting because we don't really have that. So let's just use a fetch request, and we can essentially just run it from the browser. So I'm going to go ahead to the browser, and in here we can go to console, refresh. Let's see if we are still logged in. No, we are not. So I can go ahead and say demo 123, log in. Now I'm logged in, and one more thing that you can check or validate in here is that if you go to application, you should have cookies, and the cookies should have this connect ID, which is the cookie that we are using for the session. Now, if I paste this code here, which is passing the language ID in this case, let's see what happens. If I hit enter, you can see that we got a promise pending. That is because we have a breakpoint triggered in VS Code. Now we can go forward and see if we can get the session user. So you can see we have the session user here. We get the user ID variable populated. Then we get the language ID from request.body in this case. And we have language ID not provided. That is interesting. The request body is empty. So I'm going to restart the server and look at this once again. In this case, we did have a body called language ID, but we did not have the headers being sent. And that is what we essentially require. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back here, and then the headers that we have, they should have application JSON, and this should be content type and accept, and then do this, and then also now show the code. So we do have the headers as well. And now I should be able to just run it. So I can refresh. Now we can see the headers as well. And if I hit enter, we should be able to get the body just like this. You can see the language ID here. Yay! So we go forward, get the language ID, don't get the error. Then we try to find one and update, and then we send it back. So if I hit play now, you will see that we get back the language as null. That is interesting. But if I go back to my MongoDB here and try to refresh, you should be able to see that we got this favorite languages here. Super cool. If I open this, there is a document there. And if I open the document, it has the user ID that we can see. So if I hit the network call, or actually I could have seen that while debugging, but we also have the language ID and the user ID in this case. Let's try to use a different ID now. So the user ID has EA3 at the end, and it is ACD, for example. Now what we are going to do is to try some other language like ACE in this case. Put this into the body of mark as favorite, for example here. Copy the code, and then just go ahead and change it here. And now if I run this again, this would come here. We got the user ID as the EA3. The language ID is now something different. It's ACE. And now if I go forward, it would essentially work perfectly fine. And now we have a different ID of language. So here now we got ACD. Now you see there's an interesting thing. Last time it said null, and this time this is providing the information of the previous one. And that is because right now there is a particular parameter that we need to send in this one to get the latest value. So there's a property called new, and I believe you need to set it to true. That's how you get the new one. So let's say we pick a language that is AC5. Okay. This means that when I send this call, AC5 should return. So in this case, I'm going to just paste it here, copy the code, and then I'm also going to restart the server as well. So in this case, if I refresh, post this here, go to my code, let's see what happens. I'm going to put the breakpoints in here as well. Now you will notice that in this case, the language ID is AC5. That's the new language that we are putting it. So if I now move forward, the language should contain AC5. So if I have a look at this, this is an object ID, and this object ID should be AC5. Or no. Can I see it? Can I see it? Can I see it? No, I cannot. But in here, I should be able to, right? So the language here should be, no, I cannot see it. So if I play here, I can see the language that should be AC5. So the key here is to provide this new, otherwise the find one and update function returns the previous value, not the new one. Now that we have this marked as favorite, we also need a particular call to get my current favorite. So for that, I'm gonna put the code really quickly. So I'm gonna go ahead and say something like router.get, and in here we should have a slash, and then we are going to just say async request response. Then I can get the user ID just like this. So I'm actually going to copy this. However, we don't really get the language ID. We just need the user ID in this case. And then what I could do is do something like this. So I could do this, and I can say languages, basically await favorite language dot, or actually it's not languages, it's rather language that is my favorite. So I can say find one, and that should take my username. So the username in this case, or is it user? It's user. The user should rather be user ID. And if I get this, then I can just return it. So I can say res.status 200 dot and then JSON, and in here we can say language. Now this is going to be either null or something set already. So I'm going to go to Rapid API again, and I can quickly create or duplicate this call, and I can now name this my favorite language. This is going to be a get call, and the URL is going to be the same. I can remove the body. I can also remove the headers. We don't really need those. What does it say? Get requests usually don't have a body. By default, you can change this behavior in the settings. Yeah, I understand. So now that we have this, we can remove the headers from here as well. And now we can just hit this call. Now you can see that there is no favorite languages because we need to restart our debug server. And once I do so, I can send this call. And now if I send this, this is not going to work because we don't have session here in VS Code. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and copy the fetch call here, go to the browser, and I'm just going to paste this call. So this is a get call, and then just hitting this URL and then just coming back. So if I hit enter now, you can see that the language is what we get out here. Now the interesting part here is that we may need to use this language to select it right here. For that, we need the language ID, of course, but we also would need to show the name in this case. So what I could do is that here for the language, I could also put a dot populate at the end. So I could say populate, and here I can provide an array of paths. So I can say language. And if I hit save and refresh this, you can see that once we retry this call, just like this, first of all, I would have to log in. So I can make this call. So I can say demo123, log in, go forward, and I should be able to go into the home page. And now what I can do is I can run this query. So if I run this now, you can see that we got the language. Inside the language, we have the entire language populated with the URL and the ID. So that is what I am talking about. Now that we have this call implemented and we also have the me call implemented, let's actually implement the entire home page. So what I want you to do is to go to github.com/snir/NodeRedis the link for the code repository that you can find. And then you need to go to public index.html and just copy all the code from the script tag. Once you do so, you can come back to the code and then go inside the public index.html just like this. And I'm doing this because I don't really want to spend a lot of time explaining the front-end code. In this video, we're going to probably make another video out of it. But essentially what I do is when the page loads, I make three different calls. One, I get the user data. Second, I get my favorite language. And third, I get all the languages. Once I get all the languages, I populate all of that running for each. I populate and create a select box with all the options, and then I see which is my favorite language. When I find a favorite language, then I set it automatically on the UI, and that's pretty much it. And I also use this me call to get the username so I can show this in the header. So let's save this and try this out. So I'm going to go back to my home page, and if I hit refresh now, you should see that everything is working apart from some weird use cases that I can see. So in particular, if I go to network call, if I hit refresh, and that is because the URL is incorrect. So I can replace this with favorite languages, hit save, hit refresh, and now I should be able to see something here. I also see undefined here, which is weird because that would mean that this URL is incorrect. Let's see what came out in me. So in the me call, we got the response for the user. So we got user ID, username, all of that. For the languages, we got all the languages that we wanted. For favorite languages, we got a language within a language, and then we got user and whatnot. That means that the code in the HTML is not appropriate, or the response that I'm sending back is not appropriate. So in this case, when we get back the value from favorite languages, which should be the second one, it should have a language property, which I'm getting, and then it gets the ID, and then we do some magic around there. So let's have a look at what's happening. We get the user in here, we get the value and then user. That's cool. So inside here, we come here, 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 and then we also go with the languages and we create all those languages and their URLs. So we should have all the select boxes there. And now what we need to do is to get favorite language dot value dot language. Now I remember what's wrong with this. The thing that's wrong is for the favorite language, the backend should not return this whole language because it's a favorite language. It contains a language inside. So we should rather say favorite lang here, and then here we should just say favorite lang dot language, or we say null. So if there's no favorite language, then we just say null. Otherwise this should be good. So I'm going to refresh this, go back to my code and refresh. And now I'm going to just debug and see what's happening. So in this case, we should get the favorite lang dot value, and then the value itself contains a language and then a language as well. So this means that this has not been fixed really. Or did I make a change in the wrong one? Yes, I did. So I should not be doing that, and rather this should be this one. So this should be favorite lang, and in this case there should be favorite lang dot language or null. So I'm going to save this now, refresh, and now if I refresh here, I should be able to see my favorite language, which is right now set to C, which is good. And now I should also be able to change this to others, as you can see, and this works perfectly fine. Now that we have this, let's see why this username isn't working. So I'm going to go to sources and see what's happening. So I'm going to refresh this. Here we are going to see, hey, user dot value dot username. So the user has a user property and then username inside, which means that we need to go back to our auth page. And once we see the me call, it's expecting not to have this user property. I think I should probably change the HTML here to expect that there should be a value. So instead of value.username, it should be value.user.username in this case. And once we have this, I think we should be good. So I'm going to save this now. And if I refresh, you can see that we got the username, and we also can now change the value of my favorite language. Now I'm going to open the debugger to make sure that the selection of this also works. So if I hit JavaScript and if I hit mark as favorite, let's see what happens. So if I click mark as favorite, you can see that it says 404 not found. Favorite language doesn't exist. That is because it is favorite languages. So I need to change what happens when we click this. So favorite languages should be the correct one. So I'm going to refresh this, try to make JavaScript as my favorite language. I hit mark as favorite, and now we have network call that went and it's pending now, which means there should be a breakpoint here. Now we get the session user, the user ID as well. So the user ID, the language ID from body, and then we just should save it. So here we are saving it and sending it back. So if I have a look at the response in this case, it says marked as favorite. I click OK, and now you can see that this button is disabled. So all of this is working fine. If I refresh now, I should have JavaScript as my favorite language. Yay! The last two things I want to show you is, one, we need to aggregate some data. For example, if I wanted to show everybody how many people have JavaScript as their favorite, could I show that? Yes, I could. So in that particular case, we are going to aggregate some data from MongoDB. So the way to do that is you go to your VS Code extension and you can essentially go to MongoDB and go to your playground. So if I go to my MongoDB playground, open playground, here I could essentially go and say db.favorite_languages.find. And here, if I run this, you will see that we are going to get some data out of it. We got only one record out of it, which is for SN. You could also run find.pretty if you wanted, and you would still get a result just like this. So now you see that by default pretty in this case. And now what I want to do is to aggregate the data. So in this case, what I want to do is to use the aggregate method. In this, we provide a couple of things. The first thing would be, how do we want to aggregate this? So we are going to use a group in this case because we want to group the data. The ID of this group is going to be language, and we want to group them by count. So what we can do is we can say something like count, and then the object that we provide here, we can say sum, and then just 1. Once we run this, you will see that we are going to get this data that we have a particular ID and the count of that is 1. Let's create a few users. For example, I'm going to go ahead and log out. I'm going to remove all the breakpoints for the moment. And then let's say we also have a user called Aslan. And then we say demo 1, 2, 3. And then actually we needed to register. So we can say Aslan. We can say demo 1, 2, 3. We hit register. And then we go forward from here. I'm going to remove the breakpoints. And now we got Aslan logged into the machine. So I'm going to remove from index as well. And now you can see that there's no favorite language for Aslan. So I'm going to say, let's say JavaScript is Aslan's favorite in this case. So we are going to mark that as favorite. So I can quickly go ahead and click mark as favorite. I'm going to see if the network call went there. Yeah, it's pending because we have a breakpoint. So I'm going to disable the breakpoint, hit play. And now you can see that there's a mark as favorite. So we are good. Now we have two people who like JavaScript. Let's log in with Mohsin and we are going to use a different language. So for Mohsin, I'm going to log in and mark, let's say, Kotlin as favorite. In this case, if I mark this as favorite, then that would mean if I go back to my VS Code and if I run the same playground just like this, then you would see that we are going to get two different data. So we are getting one for JavaScript and the count is 2. And the second one is for Kotlin and the count is 1. Now what I want to do is also not just to have this ID, but rather the whole language object so I can show this on some UI. To do that, we are going to pass this as a second argument of this array that we are using in the aggregate. So we are going to use something called lookup in this case, and we are going to look it up from the path. Since we are using the favorite languages, you can see that the favorite language model that we have here, which should actually have an extension of JavaScript. I don't know if it has or not, but rather it should have a JavaScript extension, something like this. Maybe that's why it was not giving me IntelliSense. But this favorite language has a language and a user in this case. So what I can do is I can provide from string, and this string is going to call languages. The local field is going to be ID in this case. The foreign field is going to be ID, and we are going to call this as language. So this is looking it up from the languages DB, and then we are running it just like this. So if we run this now, let's see what happens. And there we go. You can see that now we have this count 2 against the JavaScript language and this count against the Kotlin language. Super cool. So what we can do is we can actually copy this same function, something like this, or till the aggregate, and we can go to favorite languages, not this one, but rather the one in the routes. So we can go to favorite languages.js, and here we can create our new route, which we can call router.get, and here we have report, and we can essentially say async req res, and here we can say const languages equals, and here we do something like await favorite language dot aggregate, and then we are getting all of this in this case. Finally, once we get the languages, we simply do res dot status 200 and then dot json, and here we say languages, and that's pretty much it. Now let's save this and try this out in Rapid API. So in here we now got the my favorite language, but I can just duplicate it and go to say report, and then here I'm just gonna close the playground in this case, and I'm going to say that this is going to be favorite languages slash report, and if I hit send here, let's see what happens. Nothing, because we need to restart our server. So we restart the server, wait for a while, hit send again, and now you can see that we got all the languages there with the count and the language as well. So Kotlin and JavaScript, Kotlin got 1, JavaScript got 2, and we can now show this in the UI as well, right? Now we are left with just two things. One, we can use the Rapid API, REST API cloud, or what we call Rapid API Studio, to generate our API calls just like we did within the extension. And the benefit of that would be that we can use any device, any laptop, or any PC, and we should be able to get the project because this is not saved locally in that particular case. Right now, if I go to my VS Code, you can see that every project that we have is local. If I try to open a new project, we do have two different projects, but you can see that the default one is local here. So what I could do is I could either create a new project on Rapid API, just like this, and move all my requests to here, or I could create a new project that I can create directly in the Rapid API dashboard. So let's try that right now. So I'm going to quickly go and copy a couple of requests there. So I can go to codewithsn.dev/rapid API as I shared before. So you can go to Rapid API and then it will take you to the Rapid API hub. And here you can sign up or sign in. I have already signed in using my GitHub credentials. So what I can do is I can go to the studio. So I can just say rapidapi.com/studio in that case, and this will take me to the cloud version of the whole experience of the REST API client. You can see that I already have a project named Scorer Pro, which is from my previous video about creating and selling APIs for passive income. So if I open this, you should be able to see the requests just like we had in VS Code extension. So we have a bunch of requests that we can see right here. So imagine that this project was the Node Redis project. I could actually create it. So I could say something like add an API project. I could say Node Redis Auth CWA, and then here the category can be, for example, business software, for example, the team personnel, and we are not importing this from anywhere. So if I click add API project, I can also say something like example of Node Redis Auth API and or backend app per se, and then I click add API project. Once I do so, this means that now I can essentially use this new project as well, either in the cloud. But as I mentioned for this video, the idea was to be in VS Code all of the time. So I can now use this project even in VS Code. I can add some stuff here. For example, let's say we set up some environments from here. New environment, we can call this, for example, development in this case, right? And then the variable name could be base URL. And here I can say HTTP localhost 3000. Okay, just saving this one environment group. And now that we have this, this is automatically selected. I will not do anything at the moment apart from this, just keeping this project here. Now what I can do is I can go to my Rapid API extension in VS Code and click sign in. It will ask you to allow this to connect to Octopaw. Then you click open. And here you can see that it is going through the pod.cloud to open a link in VS Code. You click open VS Code or open in VS Code. And here you just click open. You will see a message here that says you're signed in and you can start syncing this to Rapid API, which is good. Now in here, I can now click this and you can see that this is loading now the Rapid API projects which are on the cloud. And you can see here that the team that I have is personal team in which these are being saved. So I can now click Node Redis Auth CWA and you should be able to see the environments just like this. And now I can basically create a request. For example, if I just wanted my favorite languages, I could have a particular request for this. So let's create one. Let's say that we have this one that says get favorite languages, just to see that they sync directly on the cloud. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the env variable just like this. I'm going to use the base URL in this case. And then also I'm going to just have slash favorite languages just like this. And then I can basically just hit send. And this does not return anything at all because we got an error. And that is because the request session does not exist in this moment. So instead of favorite languages, let's try languages. I think that also has the same idea. So I'm going to quickly go ahead and go to, for example, languages. And here I'm just going to hit save. And now I can try sending the request again. And now you can see that we get the data back in this case. So we got all the languages out of here. Now that we have defined this here, that would mean that this should have been synced on the Rapid API cloud or the Rapid API studio as how we call it. So if I click here sync, you can see that it would sync it automatically. And now I can go back to my browser. And here you can see that we automatically have the get favorite languages request, and I can run the same thing here. So if you want to run it into your VS Code, you can definitely run this. If you want to run this into cloud, you could also run it. The benefit of running this into extension would of course be that you are running it within your machine, so it would have the content, or the not the content but the access to localhost. You cannot really define localhost here on the cloud. The rapidapi.com doesn't have localhost, you have it. So I hope this makes sense, but it really helps to sync all of these calls or all of this API calls that we create across multiple devices, which is a super handy tool to use if you have multiple devices and want to work together just being in VS Code using the extension. Now that we have talked about it, let's talk about deploying the application to Heroku. So I'm going to go to Heroku and we are going to create an application here. So you need to go to Heroku and you need to log in there. Once you're logged in, you need to click new and then create new application. And in here, you can define the name as Node Redis Auth. And you're going to essentially just say create app, and that's pretty much it. Once you're done with that, you need to see how to deploy this. We can use GitHub for deploying this, but you could also use the Heroku CLI to deploy this manually, for example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Heroku CLI for this. So I'm going to copy this command, and obviously you need the Heroku CLI installed in your machine. So you can click this example right from the deploy tab and install Heroku CLI by following all of the instructions that are mentioned here based on your platform. Once you're done with that, you need to log in. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my VS Code. I'm going to open terminal, stop the server for now. And in here, I'm going to do git status, and you can see that this is not a git repository at this moment. So we are going to fix that as well. But for now, I'm going to do Heroku login. Now this will essentially open or try to open a page in the current browser. So I can press any key to open this. And now you can see that it goes to Heroku and I can click log in. And now you can see that it says logged in. You can close this page and return to the CLI. So now you can see that here it says that I am logged in, and here we got the email as well. So now that we are logged in, I can essentially do this. I can do git init, and then I can push this directly to Heroku. So I can copy this command git init. I'm going to do git init in this case. And then also we are going to do this. So we are going to add this remote Heroku to our project. So whenever we push to git, we are going to essentially push to Heroku. So here I'm saying, hey, Heroku git remote add, and here we are saying Node Redis Auth in this case. So if I hit enter here, you should be able to see that now we are setting the Heroku remote to the URL for git, and now we should be able to commit and push. Now you can see that we've got a lot of changes here in our application. So we probably don't want the node modules to be considered, and we also don't want VS Code to be considered, but maybe we can have VS Code and not node module. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and create a new file, and we also don't want to push the env file. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to say something like .git ignore, and then I can say .env here, and then node underscore modules. And you can ignore other files that you don't really want to push to anywhere where you're pushing your code with git. Now you can see that I have playground.mongodb, but I don't plan to remove it. So others can use that, or I can reuse it later on. And I don't think anything else needs to be removed in this case. So I think we are good. Now what you need to do is after this git ignore, you can simply do git add dot, and then you can do git commit, and you can say a commit message. For example, I can say something like feed, and here we can say something like favorite language, auth, and favorite languages. And I can simply say git push Heroku, and here I can say master. Notice that by default, the name of the branch is master. If you want, you can change it, because some of the teams don't like the name master and they change it to main. So you could do something like git branch m, and here you can basically say main. So this changes the name from master to main. And now what you could do is you could do git push Heroku, and here you can say something like main master. So this will push our main to Heroku master. If you run this, this is going to essentially publish this to Heroku. You can see that it is starting to build the resources, and it's going to do some further processing along the way, and we can see all the logs here. So now you can see that all of the log has been finished and our code is deployed to Heroku. However, if I go to this link, you will see that we'll just get an internal server error, and that is because our backend is not really configured for Heroku at the moment. We need Redis, and we also need connectivity to MongoDB in order for this to work. We also need to specify what command would run when we basically deploy to Heroku. So if I go to our Heroku dashboard, and here if I refresh here, I can go ahead and see the logs. So I click more, view logs, and here I can see all the logs here. So you should be able to see exactly what is wrong when you basically try to access the server. So here you can see that here it says secret option required for session, and here we have not provided the environment, so there is no secret or there is no session. That's why. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to settings, and inside here we have the config vars, and in here I can define the variables based on my env file. So I'm going to go to my env file or the production variables per se. So here the secret was my secret, so I'm going to copy this, then I'm going to paste it here as a value and this key as the key, and then I'm going to add it. I'm also going to add other variables, just the keys, so I can basically provide the values later on. So I can click add, and here I can also say MongoDB database and just hit add. One more thing that I just remembered that we should be doing is to having an environment variable for the Redis client. So this is by default connecting to localhost 6379, but we need to provide the URL as well. So here we can say URL, and here we can say something like process.env.redis URL, and that should be good. And I need to now provide this Redis URL inside here. So I can say something like Redis, and then here we can have localhost 6379. So we are going to use this and see if this works. So I'm going to run npm start now. And you can see that here it looks like we don't have any error. We can double check it by running it. So I'm going to go to our localhost 3000. It redirected me to login. So I can log in here. Password is incorrect, it says, so I can provide the right password. And now if I hit enter, you can see that I'm logged in, which means that Redis itself is working fine. If I refresh, you can see that the session is stored and maintained as well. So in Heroku, I'm also going to provide this Redis underscore URL variable and just add it so we can provide a value later on. Now that we have this, let's talk about how do we connect to a remote MongoDB and Redis in this case. So for Redis, you could go to redis.com or app.redislabs.com and you can just sign up from here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign up with my GitHub, so I can quickly go ahead and say GitHub, but you can essentially use any host that you provide. Here I can see that it essentially took my my company's name here instead of my name. So here it's using @synchron, but okay, let's go with that. So what I'm going to do is use the free tier for this one, and I'm going to use US 8, or actually I could use Europe in this case. So I can just say, let's start free. And once we do so, let's see how this works. So now we have this new Redis stack database here, and I'm using this for the first time as well right here. So I have not tried it yet, but let's see how this goes. So we have Synchron free DB here. If I click this, it takes us here. I can edit the database and I can name this to something like Node Redis Auth, just the database name here. And then I can copy the URL. So this is the URL that we need to provide in our code base. Obviously, I'm going to delete the database so no one can access it, but I'm going to just put it right here, click copy. And then I'm going to go to Node Redis here and then provide this value right here. So I can edit this and I can provide the value and hit save changes. Now that we have this set, let's talk about MongoDB. So for that, you can go to Mongo Atlas. So you can type Mongo Atlas here, and then you can just go there and log in or sign up if you haven't done already. So you can try the free tier. I think they're very generous, and by default you should have plenty to work with, because I think it can handle small to medium scale application if they are just passion projects. So I'm just gonna sign in to MongoDB. Once you are in your MongoDB dashboard, you can click the create button to create a new cluster. You can follow all these steps and you will end up with a cluster just like this one, the cluster 0 that I have. And then you can click connect. So you basically get a connection string that we can provide to our environment variables. So I'm going to click connect here, and you can click connect your application and you should be able to see the connection string. And I'm going to provide that right here in the MongoDB URL. So I'm going to provide this here. And here you obviously need to provide your username and your password both. So once you are done with that, click Save Changes. And finally, you need to provide the MongoDB database here. So here we can say best-languages as the database that we are going to use and hit Save Changes. And once you are done, you can just click this more, and here you can just say restart all dynos. This will essentially go and reset or restart all dynos, and you can see the logs in that case to make sure everything is working. So what I'm going to do is go to view logs. Here you can see that it says starting process, blah, blah, blah. And now you can see that we have got some instruction here. You can see that it is refusing the connection to localhost 6379. That is because we have not modified our code and not pushed it to Heroku. So if I go back to my code, you can see that we introduced this env Redis URL, and we also had that in the env variable, but I need to push this code. So I'm going to put both of these things. Actually, I'm not gonna have this explore Redis, so I can discard the changes, but I need to provide app here. So I can just add it, and I can do something like git add dot git commit. Here we can say fix Redis, and here we can say add Redis underscore URL as an env variable. And here I can just do git push Heroku main colon master. Again, I'm using main master because my local branch is main and Heroku uses master. Now I can quickly go to my Heroku logs, and here you will see that once the whole deployment is done, or this process that we see here finishes, we should have a new deployment running right after this log. Now you can see that it says restarting, and then it's starting the process with npm start. And in this case, you can see that we got invalid protocol. So we need to see what's going on there. So in here, the problem is that we don't have a protocol defined. So we need to do Redis // here, and then we need to hit save changes, and then we can restart all dynos. So I'm going to go and do restart all dynos, and I'm going to look at the logs now and see what happens. And now you can see that we restarted this and we did not get that error that we got before. In this case, you can see that the build succeeded. We also had a deploy. And now if I click open app, you can see that it works really great. Now I have the login page. I could go ahead and provide a particular user here. I could also go and sign up. If I try to go to the home page, it will take me to the login page. So the redirection is working fine. And I can go to my Redis and see if I can see anything there. And I can also see my MongoDB database. So let's keep them closed so we can monitor them. So we have Heroku here. We got the database here. We got Redis here and the app. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to log in via some account. So I can say sn demo123. If I hit login, would it work? No, the user does not exist because we just deployed our application to production. We have a new Redis instance or a new database. We also have a new MongoDB database in this cluster that we are going to use. So in here, if you go ahead and see collections, you should be able to see the list of collections and the databases. So here you can see that we got the best languages database, and it already got some stuff in there. So we got languages, users, all of them are 000 because there's no data inside there yet. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a user. So I can simply go ahead and say something like sn demo123, and I can hit register in this case. Once I do register, you can see that I got an error. Let's see why we have that error. So I'm going to go to logs and see what's happening. To actually see the Redis database, what we can do is we can use the public endpoint from the subscription, or you can get it from the database. So you can copy all of this. And then if you go down below in the security section, you can also see the password, which we can use to connect. So to connect, you would basically run this command. Notice that we are using Redis CLI in Ubuntu, and here we are providing the U, after which we are providing the whole URL, and then we have A, and A basically is the password. Once you're done with that, you can hit enter, and then you should be able to access the Redis CLI. So here, if I type keys and just asterisk, you will see that here we get the session value out of here. And this is the single session that we have created so far. Let's try creating one more. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy the URL, open an incognito tab. And here we are going to use another, or we are going to create another session here. So we could do, or actually we could just try login as well. So we could do something like sn and then the password. here, and then if I hit login, then I've created a new session within this browser, which is incognito at the moment. So if I go ahead to my Ubuntu window, and here if I do keys asterisk again, you can see that now we got two sessions. There we go. Our Redis server, which is on the cloud, is now having all those sessions, and these are going to be stored there until they are expired. Now that we have this, let's try the other APIs as well. So here you can see that I cannot really select any language, and that is because our database has not been populated so far. And the only way to run the command right now is from our code base, because Heroku doesn't allow us at the moment to run scripts right there. So we have to run it locally. So I'm going to go ahead to our Heroku console, and I'm going to go to settings, and I'm going to copy the MongoDB URL. So you can click reveal config vars and then just copy the MongoDB URL. And I'm going to go into my env file. So I can open here, and then I can go to env, and I can replace the MongoDB URL just like this. Once done, all I need to do is to run the dbseed.js once. Now you could also add this script into package.json into scripts. So you could do something like here, you could say db seed, and here you could say something like node, and here dbseed.js. By doing this, we can now run this command here by just saying npm run dbseed, or you could have just run node seed, whatever, or node dbseed, whatever you prefer. So if I hit enter now, you can see that it says languages added to the database. Woohoo. Yay. So now the languages should be added to the database. Let's check it real quick. So I'm going to go to my MongoDB database, and I'm going to go to languages. And here you can see that now we got 17 languages populated, which means that if I go back to my incognito window, just like this, so far we didn't have any language, but if I refresh the page now, and if I click here, you can see that we are now getting all the languages. Yay! Now we can also select a language and mark it as favorite. So I can select JavaScript here and mark as favorite. And then you can see that this API also works. I can click OK, and I can probably log out from here and just close this. And now if I check my session in Ubuntu, let's see what happens. If I do keys asterisk, you can see that the second session that I just closed by closing the incognito window and actually logging out first, you can see that here we only have one session now. So I can go back to my normal browser, go back to the page or the application. And since I'm already logged in here with my user SN, and I did not have any languages before, but if I refresh now, I should get both the languages and my favorite language as selected. Awesome. So now I can also log out from here, go to Ubuntu, and just see this. And you can see that we don't have anything in the Redis database. So now our application is live out there, deployed to Heroku. We are using a cloud Redis. We are using a cloud MongoDB, and it's going to be same if you try some other provider for Redis, MongoDB, or even for Node.js. So it's going to be exactly the same. Things might be a bit different on how you define environment variables and how you deploy things, but I think more or less it's the same concept. So now we have a live application in production with the HTTPS SSL certificate, and we also have this so anyone can basically start using it. Now that we are done with the deployment, I would want you to go to my GitHub, and if you like what you see, please become a follower, give the repository a star, but I'm not going to save my repository here in my profile. I'm going to post it inside this code with SN organization. So what I can do now is to create a new repository inside code with SN. So here I'm going to select code with SN, and I'm going to name this Node Redis Auth here. And then I can essentially provide a description, but I'm going to keep this public. I don't need any of these, so I can just click create repository, and you can essentially do the same. Now we have already initiated Git. We already have some code, and all I need to do is to just add the remote here. So I can just copy this, or you can also see the directions from here. So I can just copy this whole statement here. Then I'm going to go to my code here, and I can simply say git add dot. And I can see that the settings JSON actually contains the access to the Redis server, which also contains the password. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unstage this settings JSON. So I'm going to reset this. And now I'm just going to add the changes that we have had. So I can do git add dot and then git commit. Here we can say just a simple thing with the script. So chore package.json, and here we can simply say added db seed script to package JSON. And now I can do this. So I can basically add the remote just like this, git remote add origin, And we have this one that you can see. For you, obviously, it would have your username. And now I can do something like this: git push -u origin main. And this would essentially push the code from our local main branch to GitHub. So if I go back to my browser, you can see that previously it looked like this, but if I just refresh, I should be able to see the entire code here. And you can see that this was 30 seconds ago that I updated this. So now we have our code that you can access. You can see we have an application that is deployed already. So what I can do is I can actually put the URL inside this repository just like this. And I think we are good from here. The very last thing that we would want to make sure in this application is that every route that should be authenticated has the middleware. So I'm double checking it right now, what we have in our routes. So in the register route, we don't need it. For login, we don't need it. For me, we do need it. So we are using it. And here for logout, we don't really need it. Or you could say we need it because if there's no session, then yeah, the logout URL shouldn't even exist. So maybe we can just provide authenticated here. And after this, we do have favorite languages. Now these should be using, or this should only work when the user is authenticated. So we can say authenticated here. And I'm only doing this again after having to build the entire application, especially because VS Code or any REST API client would not have cookies in there. So we need to make sure that we are using it correctly. So I'm going to say authenticated here, and then I'm going to use the authenticated one here as well, and in the report as well. Finally, I'm going to go to index, and here I think we should be good. We should go to home only if we are authenticated. So in this particular situation, if I go to middleware, you can see that here it just says not authorized. So we don't really need to do that in index. We should rather do redirect rather than saying you're not authorized to go here. So we should rather do this. And for languages, in this case, I think we can keep the languages API open for anyone to be able to use this. So I think we are good there. And I can remove this from here. And then also I can push this to the GitHub. So I'm going to just add this, and I'm going to go ahead and commit this. So I can say git commit m, and here I can say fix authenticated. And here we can say add authenticated middleware to correct routes. And I can push this to origin. So I git push origin main. And I can also push this to Heroku for another deployment, so our routes are protected. So I can simply say something like git push Heroku and here main master. And yes, I think that should be it. All right, so I hope you liked the video. If you did, press that thumbs up button, smash it hard, and also make sure to subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Go through the other videos that you see on your screen if you want to learn more about JavaScript, frontend, and backend. Having said that, take care of yourself. I'm Asan, and I'm going to see you in the next video.